Bloomberg's Ewan Potts joins us now with more from London. So, Ewan, what were the first steps that Keir Starmer has already taken and will want to take into the weekend and beyond?
Hi, Vonnie. Yeah, I know you love some July 4th fireworks. Well, we've had some of our own July 4th election fireworks here in the UK. Britain has a new Prime Minister. He is 61-year-old former lawyer Keir Starmer. Now, he's a little bit older than some of our recent Prime Ministers. I guess in US terms, that makes him a very young man. But he brings a lot of experience to the job, and he's won by a landslide, a big victory for the opposition Labour Party and a crashing defeat for Rishi Sunak's Conservatives. The party of Brexit and Boris Johnson booted out by the British people. You asked me about those first steps. He's already started appointing his cabinet. We have Rachel Reeves in place as the new Chancellor, so she's heading up the Treasury Department. She's actually the first ever female Chancellor in Britain. We've had 3 female Prime Ministers, but never a female Chancellor. And for once, she's an economist. That's also quite unusual, leading that department. So she's a former Bank of England economist. So she's going to be in charge of the finances. And we have a new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. He's been making efforts to build bridges with both the Democrats and the Trump team in the US. He's got quite a lot of US connections. He went to Harvard Law School, and he's reportedly a friend of Barack Obama's as well. So those are 2 key appointments already in place from Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Hey, Ewan, we're a global program, but certainly at this time of the day, a lot of Americans listening right now. Can you give us some historical context here, really contextualize how big of a moment in history this is for Starmer to win and for Labour to win in a landslide such as this? How big of a deal is this?
Well, it's an enormous electoral swing. I think the electoral cycle tends to change only in the UK every 15 or 20 years or so. We've had the Conservatives in power for 14 years now, since 2010. The last time they won big, the Labour Party, was in 1997. Of course, that was Tony Blair. He won a majority of 179 in the House of Commons. Keir Starmer's majority is very close to that, 170. So it is a big win for the Labour Party. But you'll remember, if you cast your mind back to 2019, they had a crashing defeat. They were led by a very left-wing leader called Jeremy Corbyn, kind of the Bernie Sanders, if you like, of British politics. And that did not go down well with the British electorate. So they've really turned themselves around. They moderated their agenda. They've pivoted back to the centre. And they put forward a really moderate programme, a programme of stability. They're promising to end the chaos. It's been a pretty turbulent few years in the UK. We've had 5 Prime Ministers over the course of the Tory years. That's not something we're used to. So they're promising to bring back stability and, in Keir Starmer's words, to end the chaos.
Yeah, and I mean, some of that instability was due to, you know, the dreaded word Brexit, which wasn't really used an awful lot in the last few weeks. What about now? What kind of relationship will Keir Starmer want with Europe, with European politicians, bearing in mind that we don't know who some of the actual politicians will be even yet?
Yeah, of course, there's plenty of political uncertainty in Europe, as you mentioned, Vonnie. In terms of relations with the US, as I say, lots of bridge building with the United States. Plenty of questions in the campaign about how Keir Starmer would deal with President Trump, because I think it's probably fair to say that they are 2 very different personalities. Keir Starmer is a rather kind of uptight, serious figure. He doesn't really shoot from the hip. He he thinks first and speaks in a very considered way. But of course, we have had unusual partnerships in the past before. Tony Blair and George W. Bush, of course, famously were quite good friends. They became allies, and they're from different parties as well. So that is possible. But I think Biden and Starmer, of course, are on the same side of the political spectrum. So perhaps that is a partnership which could work. And on that important question of European relations, you're exactly right, Vonnie. Brexit was the dog that never barked in the UK election. Nobody really wanted to talk about it. The parties were quite happy not to mention it in this election. We're all a little bit bored of it, quite frankly. The Labour Party, for its part, though, says it won't rejoin the European Union or the Customs Union or the single market, but they do want closer ties with Europe, gentle steps towards working better with our European friends and allies. Remember, of course, that Labour didn't want to leave the European Union in the first place, but they've been clear that they only want incremental moves towards working more closely with Europe.
Incremental, gentle steps. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts joining us from London. Ewan, really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. I take a look at CRYP Go on the Bloomberg terminal, and it's a sea of red, with Bitcoin down 3%, Ether down 5%, Bitcoin falling for a 4th consecutive trading session, reaching the lowest level since February. So could Labor's sweeping win lead to more regulations for crypto? There's always a crypto angle, I think it's fair to say. Laura Navaratnam is UK policy lead at the Crypto Council. It's a global alliance focused on advancing crypto innovation. She joins us now. Good to have you with us, Laura. Certainly for the market speaking right now, they're not optimistic, or perhaps you could argue that it was priced in, but we're seeing crypto slide no matter what we're talking about right now. How do you view Labor's win in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've just said, an absolute historic win for Labour, 412 seats out of a possible 650, so a very convincing majority. But Labour have not made any public statements about crypto assets yet. So industry is understandably a little bit nervous about which direction Labour is going to go in. But as with any change in government, this does represent an opportunity for industry to re-engage, to, highlight the importance of the crypto asset ecosystem, to really underscore what the big issues are, and to work together on building a robust regulatory framework. It's also really important to remember that in the UK, the regulator is independent. So these changes in politics will not influence the remit or mandate of the regulator, certainly in the short term.
Right, and Laura, if you're Labour right now, aren't there an awful lot more fiscal priorities than, crypto and crypto regulation, given that so many other countries are fighting for the lead on crypto anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had 14 years of Conservative government. It is inevitable that there will be other things on Labour's priority list ahead of crypto. But I think there are three really key areas that Labour can focus on to make some very quick wins. One of those is around stablecoins. So the UK government needs to finalise legislation to bring stablecoins within the regulatory perimeter. This is an exercise that started under the Conservative government, so we now need Labour to continue to trust and rely on its policy experts and to lay that legislation as quickly as possible. The other area is around important technical infrastructure activity that ensures the security of the broader network. So how and where staking interplays with financial services regulation is really crucial to get right. And the third area I think the Labour government should be focusing on is financial promotions. So in the UK, we've had rules governing how you can advertise and promote crypto since the beginning of the year, but those rules are pretty broad in terms of territoriality and have a lot of complexity in them. So understandably, firms are struggling with certain aspects of implementation. So we would love further clarity from policymakers in terms of what is and isn't in scope.
Laura, here in the U.S., there's a lot of money from crypto going to presidential candidates and also especially down-ballot candidates, even more so. I'm wondering if crypto wasn't all a part of the campaign for the candidates.
I don't think it was, to be quite honest. As I say, there have been a lot of issues in the UK over the last years. We are still reeling from COVID. We have a cost of living crisis. We have high inflation. We have an NHS on its knees. We have a junior doctor strike. So there are so many issues that many of the parties have been focused on. And I think that's a reason why Labour has not necessarily pushed on its digital assets agenda. But now is the time that it can do that, because crypto assets in the UK are here and they are here to stay. And it is no longer a question of, do we want them in our market? It's a question of, who do we want to regulate them? Is it us or is it going to be somebody else?
All right, Laura, we will wait and see what pans out. That is Laura Navaratnam, Crypto Council for Innovation Policy Lead there in the United Kingdom. This, of course, post the election, which saw Labour win in a landslide vote. Speaking of elections, we do have Joe Biden, who is not formally the nominee yet for the Democratic Party and who may not end up being that. He is speaking in Madison, Wisconsin. In just a few moments, we'll bring you those comments live because, of course, all eyes are trained on the current president right now. He's speaking later on to ABC. David Weston, host of Wall Street Week, joins us now in our studio. And David, I say that all eyes will be trained on him because he needs to show a lot of vigor, a lot of youth, and a lot of ability to be completely off the cuff here, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, I would think that would be a tall order on the best of days and the best of circumstances. This is not that, certainly. Having said that, I think that appearance in the rally may be the easier of his two tasks today, because it appears that right after that, he's going to sit down with my old colleague and friend, George Stephanopoulos of ABC News. And George is going to need to put him through his paces to try to demonstrate, if he can, to the American people that what they saw on that stage truly was an aberration.
David, we love talking to you for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because you ran ABC News for years. If you were running ABC News at a moment such as this, what would be the meeting that you would have had with Stephanopoulos and his team ahead of this interview?
Well, the way, at least it worked when I was there, is I would sit with the anchor and the political director, in this case, the executive producer probably of the evening news, and go
lawyers.
through. Sorry?
And more lawyers.
Yeah, well, it really goes through what's the strategy? What do we want to try to get out of this? What are we trying to deliver to the American people? And you go through the strategy overall. I mean, you don't micromanage. I mean, George is a pro, and he knows politics and TV news terribly well. But at the same time, it seems to me it's pretty clear what the overall goal would be, which is to try to demonstrate to the American people, if the president can, that he is capable of doing the job. And part of that, for me at least, just as a citizen, is what does he think happened that night in that debate? And more important, what steps is he taking, can he take to make sure it doesn't happen again? Because having a bad night when it's Vladimir Putin invading Poland or something like that, that's just not a good thing.
It's a difficult one, though, isn't it, David? Because it's hard to know how to respond. I mean, if somebody asks you, it's the old adage, right? How do you respond to when did you last beat your, spouse? I mean, you can't say, well, I never have. I mean, it's very hard to prove a negative. I mean, he started saying things like, well, I need to go to bed earlier and so on. That doesn't really provoke confidence.
Yeah, listen, it's very hard, no doubt about it. Now, I will say, I think being president of the United States is hard. It's a hard job from the get-go, and it sort of comes with the territory, and you don't get graded on a curve. Maybe that's fair, maybe it's unfair, but that's the way the world works. And that's what the American people expect from him. At the same time, I think it really is a question of really seeing how agile he is, how much in command he is, how much he understands the significance of what's happening, and how he could really lead the country forward. I mean, it's a hard job. I agree, Vaughn, and there's nothing easy about this, but I don't see where he has any other route. I mean, I don't think he can just do a rose garden strategy, stay in the White House, and expect people to vote for him given what they saw on the debate stage. I think he's got to come out now. He's actually put himself in a jam to some extent. I'm not saying he did it on purpose. Put himself in a jam. He has to take more risks, ironically, rather than less risks in order to overcome that impression.
Something that we talked about earlier with Joe Matthew and Rick Davis is the idea that from the debate last Thursday night until now, David, everybody's been focused on this one singular question and the other questions that come along with it. What they haven't been focused on is what differentiates the two candidates, how their policies are different, and how they're promising to run the country in a different way from one another. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of somebody who has worked in media for an entire career, if that just continues if Biden doesn't step aside. And then there's basically no coverage of how he's a different candidate.
Well, he has made it the issue, without a doubt, and it has displaced questions about policy, which is what I know he would like to talk about. By the way, I think part of George's task tonight is to get the president to go beyond all the wonderful things he's done. And you can say he accomplished an awful lot. I think most people objectively would say he has. Even people who disagree with what he did would have to say, boy, he got an awful lot done. And that is quite a record, no question about it. But at this point, given what happened in the debate, that's almost irrelevant for the moment, because it's not a question of what you did, it's a question of what you're going to do over the next 4 years, and are you up to that job? So to some extent, he's really put himself in that situation. But I think if I were he or I were advising him, I would say, that's your one job. You got to do that. We won't get to the policy things unless you get past the competence question, which now is put on the agenda.
Well, and it's also really taken the eye off Donald Trump's court cases and all of everything that's been going on with Donald Trump, and he's been keeping quiet on that front.
I was just going to say, isn't it remarkable? It seems to be at the moment a different Donald Trump than what we saw in 2016 or 2020, and all of a sudden he's gotten disciplined, and he's being quiet, and it's that old adage that when your opponent is destroying themselves, get out of the way. Yep. You don't want to contribute anyway. In fact, the only thing I saw out of him today, there might be more news, was him disowning that 2025 plan that's been floated that would be a radical Trump. He said, I had nothing to do with that. Some of it I think is ridiculous. If anything, he sort of tacked toward the center. I mean, just not the Donald Trump that I thought we knew.
Either somebody's advising him or he's being uncharacteristically restrained right now, David. I mean, I think we saw that in the debate. And a question that I had was, I know these rules were put in place that were agreed upon by the two candidates, and not to harp on the debate, but the whole reason we're talking about this is because of the debate. But having the former president's mic cut off when he wasn't speaking probably did him a huge favor, because he could let Biden just speak, and that's what hurt him so much.
Isn't it ironic?
It really is.
Because from everything we can tell, President Biden and his team really wanted that debate. They're the ones who agreed to it. And they agreed to all those terms and those structures, perhaps thinking that he wouldn't be able, that is, Donald Trump, would be able to abide by them. And at least watching it, I thought it benefited him. It made him more concise. He knew that he had to get the answer done. If he didn't, the mic would be turned off. He didn't have an audience to play to, so he didn't go over the top. He wasn't getting a reaction from an audience. So ironically, I think it led him to at least appear to be more disciplined and focused. I mean, different question, whether what he was saying was true or not, or whether he was exaggerating or he was mischaracterizing. There was a lot of things said by Donald Trump and the thing, but it was done in a very focused, disciplined way.
How will Biden come to a decision himself? Because ultimately this will be his decision. And yes, his family, and yes, advisors and supporters and so on. But will he continue to put in huge days with lots of public appearances for the course of the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and into the nomination?
Well, I think the second question first, I think where he is right now, he's put himself in a position where he's going to have to do more rather than less. I don't think he can dial back right now. Maybe at some point, but not right now. He can't do that. I obviously don't know what President Biden is thinking or his team is thinking. We can refer to what we've been told in the past, that the main question for him is who can beat Donald Trump. And his belief that he's the only one who has beaten him, the only one who can beat him. Now, there's a question of whether his mind is being changed as he's seen some of the numbers come in right now, which are raising questions about all of that. But the other thing I think, and this is just projecting from when I had my own little crises running ABC or ABC News, one of the things I learned was when it's all coming in at you and you're really in trouble, don't decide anything until you need to decide it. There's a temptation to rush in and try to solve it all and decide things prematurely, and you don't know. If I were he, I would be saying, let's wait a few days and see what happens with the numbers, see what happens with my performance in the debate, in the interview. Let's take some time and let this absorb, because you can overreact in crises, and there's a lot of hydraulic pressure to do just that.
So what would be the moment where he needs to decide? Is it just ahead of the convention? So there is some sort of, not necessarily a brokered convention, but there is some sort of switch that happens ahead of that?
I think there's, somebody should double check me on this, I've read about it, I think there's a little more pressure than that because Ohio has a law now that says it's got to be some period before the election. So I think that there's a time in, I think late this month, July, that they've got to have that virtual convention where they get the nomination, right? And so,
this is because of a printing of the ballot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So I think his hand may be getting forced now. Whether that can be changed or not, I don't know, but that sounds pretty cumbersome. And I don't think he would want to do that. But I think I don't think it's just waiting until the convention. I think he's got to make his mind up before that. But from what I know, it's not. I think making a decision today versus a week from today, I'm not sure it makes a difference. And also, he may think, I want to get through the NATO meetings. For him to say, I'm no longer a candidate just on the eve of the NATO meetings, which are pretty important. Again, I'm just projecting here. I'm just speculating. But if I were advising him, I'd be thinking about that.
Kamala Harris right now, obviously she's going to be publicly completely supporting the president and everything that comes out of the White House. She's not going to say anything at all unless she's asked to say things and so on. Privately, however, she must be wondering if she can start making some phone calls, if she can maybe get out there in the public eye a little bit more. Is she stymied right now? Can she do nothing for herself?
Well, again, I don't know the internal dynamics, but again, if I were advising her, I'd say the one thing you need right now, you have an audience of one, and that is Joe Biden. You need him to come to the conclusion that he wants to step aside and is going to back you. And I would not, if I were advising her, say I wouldn't do anything that might jeopardize that. The rest of it can take care of itself. And again, it's not going to be better making those phone calls a week from now or 2 weeks from now than it is today. But if Joe Biden got the impression, or Jill Biden, his wife, or his brother or whatever got the impression you're trying to push him out, I think that could backfire. Again, I'm just speculating. I have no inside information at all, but that's the way I would think about it.
We're expecting the president to take to the podium at a campaign event in Madison, Wisconsin in a few minutes. Typically, we don't take campaign events because, well, for a lot of reasons, but this one's different. And I think every event will be looked at under a new sort of microscope in the wake of what happened last week, David. The question is, though, does an event like this even move the needle? Because this is not a debate. This is not him off the cuff, not with NATO leaders. This is not him at a press conference. This is the Joe Biden, potentially, who we saw last Friday in Raleigh, North Carolina, who was a completely different Joe Biden.
Yeah, well, of course, the world's very different since that debate, and now it is potentially news whenever the president makes a public appearance of any sort. That wouldn't have been true before. Earlier, I would have said absolutely not. We don't take, as you say, campaign events, because they should buy campaign airtime if they want to do that. We don't give it to them. And some people have criticized the media actually for doing that for Donald Trump in 2016, giving him too much coverage of too many campaign events. But right now, I think, again, I'm not making those decisions anymore. It's above my pay grade. I think you sort of can't afford not to take it in case he does make news, because if something bad happened, that would be big news, and you sort of don't want to be caught on that. It's an asymmetric risk, as we say, Tim.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I mean, how much can everybody pry into his medical history, into his current medical state? I mean, there was a question mark over whether he had seen a doctor, and then suddenly it came out that he had seen a doctor and so on. I mean, can we know every last detail, given that we didn't for Donald Trump many a time?
Yeah, I don't think, personally, I think that there's a limit to that. I don't think we have a right to see every confidential doctor's analysis of his state. I do think, as I say, we have the right to know, is he up to doing the job? And part of that answer, I think, has to be, what was the problem? You know, from his point of view, what was the problem? And we've had 3 or 4 explanations so far. You know, he was tired, he had a cold, he was jet lagged, things like that. But he's the president of the United States. He knows himself better than anybody else knows him. And so from his point of view, what was the problem? Because that, I think, is essential to know, how do you avoid it happening again? Which, I think for the American people, that's the most pertinent question. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, we will be hearing, as we say, from President Joe Biden in just a few moments on that campaign stop in Madison, Wisconsin. But I do want to bring in somebody else into the conversation. And she's been watching the UK election, but also, obviously, all things going on in the United States right now. And that is Tina Fordham, who we love speaking to. Tina is geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Foresight. Tina, first, before we get to the UK or anything like that, can I ask you your impression of what's going on in the United States right now? It sort of took a left turn. We were all highly focused on everything court related to Donald Trump, and suddenly now we're focused on whether President Biden could even run for another term.
Well, for me, it was entirely consistent with what we were thinking about this election. There are too many variables, too many new factors and fluidity in this race for it to follow a typical U.S. elections playbook. And that's exactly how it's playing out. Things are starting to come loose.
Yeah, I guess the question is how much more loose do they become before things start to, I guess, become tighter? And that's certainly a question a lot of Democrats are probably asking right now, Tina.
Absolutely. But what we're observing is how campaigns and leaders, no matter how dedicated they are, can't control everything about the process. That's what we're witnessing now. I mean, I've encountered a fair amount of hostility for, my observations straight after the debate, saying, I think that performance was a game changer, and age is not reversible. Of course, Biden will do better in other contexts, other environments. He is a very competent politician with a great deal of experience and has presided over an important economic recovery as far as I'm concerned. But Americans are right to ask if he can serve until 2029. And it isn't a matter for his comms team to simply provide reassurance.
Yeah, exactly, Tina. And just by the end of today, we'll have a lot of commentary from Joe Biden. As I say, we're waiting for his comments from Madison, Wisconsin. But if it were to happen that Joe Biden steps aside and somebody else comes in, be it Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom or whoever it may be, what would that do for Donald Trump's chances of winning? And I mean, we have head-to-head polling right now, but we are still very far away from Election Day when it comes to U.S. elections.
Well, we're very far, and yet I think I'd make the case that if a change is going to take place on the Democratic ticket, it needs to happen in the next few weeks. The NATO summit in 2 weeks' time is a major signpost. Actually, it's next week, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The U.S. will be hosting in Washington world leaders, including the new UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, and possibly a new French Prime Minister, almost certainly a new French Prime Minister. So a lot of change in the global environment. that would also be an opportune time for the U.S. Head of state to speak to allies. But that may be a faster timetable than the White House and the Biden team are prepared to look at.
We do have an article out on the Bloomberg about allies being concerned overseas about the current president's ability to win election come November. I'm wondering what kind of pressure, if any, that could put on Biden to step aside.
Well, there'll be reluctance from U.S. allies to put on any pressure, that's for sure. But part of the reason, if not the main reason, why U.S. allies and indeed my CEO and investor clients here in Europe are so concerned about Biden's state is because they are so worried about a return of Trump to the White House. And that is a really consistent view across the political spectrum, just because of the feared implications of a Trump 2.0 on the global trade environment, tariffs, and security. Remember that here in Europe, security with the war in Ukraine, as well as the Middle East, #1 consideration, and U.S. consistency on that is very much in focus.
Tina, you probably didn't think you were coming on to talk U.S. Given the British election that we've just had. We suddenly have a new regime. Does anything change in Britain radically pretty soon? And I'm talking about anything from relationship with Europe to fiscal policy to any kind of social policy.
Well, I think British voters certainly hope for a change. They gave the Conservative Party, which, remember, the Conservatives have been in power for 14 years, a real drubbing last night. It was something to behold. And one of the things that will be surprising for your U.S. viewers is that Rishi Sunak is already out of Downing Street. The removal van has been, Keir Starmer has met with King Charles, and it's all changed. Same with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So there's no grace period, there's no lame duck period, there's not even a transition period. The new team will be in their seats in the coming days. A Labour Party government with a majority represents a significant change, particularly a departure with Brexit. And remember, that's probably the signature achievement as such for the outgoing Conservative Party. But the cupboard is also bare for Sir Keir Starmer, and he's really made the biggest promises about returning the UK to growth. Growth here is languishing, and restoring public services. So business is actually backing Labour for the first time that I can remember.
That's a part of his speech. It was this morning for me, but this afternoon for you, that really struck me earlier today, was the idea that government is there to help and that the services are there for the people. They are I mean, you don't necessarily hear that here in the United States. A lot of people think government really gets in the way, and that's certainly the philosophy of a lot of folks here in the U.S. Can you explain how things like the NHS have been under pressure and how it's such a loved organization and how that was so crucial to Labour's victory here?
Yeah. Crumbling public services appear in the top 3 concerns for British voters. It will surprise Americans on the right to understand that the NHS is a much-loved national institution. People look with horror at the United States, and the idea of medical bankruptcies doesn't exist in this country. And so finding a way for the NHS to be more efficient in light of an aging population and everything else is a major task, to be sure, and one that I think any incoming government would have to be looking at tax increases. But the American viewers need to resist the temptation to kind of put everything in U.S. terms. Labour Party has got socialist in its name. It has taken a lot of steps to cultivate ties in the City of London, our equivalent of Wall Street. And frankly, the Conservative Party has not been the party of business for some time. With Brexit, they kind of threw financial services under the bus. Labour will have no honeymoon, and their landslide victory is probably more of a kicking to the outgoing Conservatives. Someone called it a loveless landslide, and I think that that's probably fair. But also, it has been a completely peaceful, civilized, drama-free transition. And I think that should be inspiring for us Americans.
Oh, yes, a drama-free transition. Gosh, when did we last have one of those? I'm really not quite sure. Tina, thank you so much. Can't wait to keep in touch with you throughout the next few months. That's Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Foresight on the British elections, but of course on what's happening in the United States now as well. Well, you wouldn't believe it because it's been so captivating waiting for Joe Biden to speak and to talk jobs and everything that we've had going on today. But we're actually less than 45 minutes away from the market close today, and I'm sure many people have gone to the beach, but it was a very, very intense market day. We had a lot of stocks higher and indices moving higher. The Nasdaq, for example, up about 1% now in terms of the Nasdaq 100. So let's turn back to the markets and bring in Jeffrey Klingelhofer, who is co-head of investment at Thornburg, which has $44 billion in assets under management, and Bloomberg Opinion's Nir Kesar, who joins us in studio and always has an interesting take on these markets. Well, Nir, I don't remember where NVIDIA was at the last time I spoke with you, which is probably maybe more than a year ago now, but it certainly is changing this market. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on whether NVIDIA will continue to be the story going forward or whether the economic data, the macro picture, will become more important.
Well, I think, hi, Vonnie, hi, Tim. Good to be with you here in the studio. It's always a treat. NVIDIA certainly wasn't the star. It has always been a star, but it wasn't the star it was a year ago that it is today. And I think it's made itself important. And I think it's more important psychologically than anything else because it seems to be the only stock anyone cares about now. Certainly you can understand why. They're at the forefront of the AI trend. The AI trend seems to be moving markets in general, and so it's going to continue to be important. But I think, it's what's interesting about NVIDIA is it's really in a very small company, right? It's in a very small group of stocks that have just become so structurally important to this market because a lot of what's moved the market higher over the last few years is really the earnings growth of these small number of stocks. And if that earnings growth has to continue. We're talking about earnings growth of about 40% a year or more. It has to continue at that pace for this market to keep moving. So yes, it's NVIDIA, but it's also Google and Microsoft and Apple, et cetera.
Yeah, Meta Platforms and Apple both at intraday all-time highs, reaching new records today. I want to bring in Jeff Klingelhofer, co-head of investments over at Thornburg Investment Management. Jeff, what do you make of that? Are you concerned that there is such a high concentration of a small number of stocks that are mega cap tech stocks that are responsible for so much of the gains that we've seen in the last 2 years?
I'm concerned on some levels, absolutely. But really, what we should be focusing on is not just the breadth. I mean, at any given time, there are going to be a couple very large leaders. What I'm most concerned about is really the earlier point that earnings are growing 40, 50%, and just the expectations of that continued growth really for time that almost becomes impossible. The market collapses under its own weight. And as an additional challenge to that, the U.S. economy is shrinking. And so we're waiting for Biden to take the stage. We're waiting for politics to reinsert itself, but really rates and the Fed have been a lot of what's been behind some of this extreme expansion and concentration from the growth companies, and I worry about that given the continued deficits as we look forward.
Oh, deficits coming up. It's actually not something that comes up all the time. We talk about it a lot when we look at what's going on in the bond market, but doesn't seem like bond markets are really caring about deficits yet at this point. Nir, you're kind of shaking your head like they are starting to care a little bit. How concerned should investors be about the spend? I mean, look, we hear a lot about spending from the two front runners in the Republican and Democratic tickets, but what we don't hear a lot about is how they're going to pay for this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at debt to GDP ratios, for example, we're at probably 1.2, maybe. So we've been here before in the post-war period. We've been here before. It's not unprecedented, and I wouldn't ring the alarm bells yet. I wouldn't say this is a crisis, but I would say that we are at an inflection point, and we have to see where it's going to go. I mean, we don't want to see this thing get to 2.5 times. So, if we are able to grow the economy, if we are able to rein in spending, which I grant you is a huge if, given the gridlock in Congress, et cetera, I think we're okay, and I think that's why you're not seeing a freak out in the bond markets. However, if you see that 1.2 start to creep up to 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, I will be very surprised if bond markets don't react. We've never really been there before, but let's reserve judgment and see where it goes.
Yeah, what about that, Jeff? I want to come back to you on that because in fixed income, you say you're playing defense because spreads are tight, but that can change on a dime, right? The MOVE index has been incredibly volatile.
And that's exactly it. And really, in the world of fixed income, the beauty of it is it's back, right? Income is higher, and not just income from the world of fixed income, but also income from dividend-paying stocks in the global atmosphere. There's a lot of interesting places that investors should be focusing on. And really what the question has been, not in the fixed income markets, but in the equity markets, is how far can NVIDIA run? How far can some of these mega cap tech companies really, really run? And there's lots of reasons to believe that they still have some room. But when you take the starting place of valuations and you look forward 5, 6, 7, or 10 years, we like to look a little bit more internationally and focus on giving investors just a much more smooth ride. And really in the world of fixed income, going back to deficits, it's not that there's likely to be a, quote, freak out moment. It's that this is directly intertwined to how fast inflation can fall, and then therefore how much central banks have the room to cut rates to cushion that next cycle. But we haven't emerged from a world where cycles will happen, and we're in the midst of one happening now. And central banks really have their hands tied and continue to have their hands tied.
Yeah, and then Near, you have to wonder if we do start to see a cutting cycle begin, does that also allow markets to rally? We've had this massive rally so far just this year, 14%, and of course we know in previous years it's also been incredible, at least since the pandemic, to the extent that, an 8% return just seems paltry now. And when a hedge fund comes out and says, oh, we had a 10% return, we're amazing, you're kind of thinking, well, hang on a second, I could have just put my money in the S&P. Does that continue?
Well, I'll tell you, I think we're all playing a big game of chicken. That's the way I read this market. And the reason I say that is because you look at the international markets over the last, say, since 2010, they've been awful. Just absolutely awful. And the U.S. market writ large has been fine, but not amazing. If you want to attribute the returns, we're really, again, coming back to this handful of stocks, right? And I hear from a lot of people who say to me, my exposure on Apple, Google, Microsoft is like 90% of my portfolio. What do I do, right? And that's an implicit recognition. These companies are not going away, right? So there's no, I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and fear that these companies are not going to have the market share, that not going to have a great market share, let's just say. But they may not be the performers that they were. And so the question is, how long are we all going to hold our breath and hope that these companies continue to carry the entire global stock market? And this is a problem that everybody has in their portfolio, at least implicitly, because the market has become these companies. I mean, a third of the market is that, when people talk about the market, you almost have to say, what are you talking about? Because if you're talking about the global, if you're talking about the S&P 500, you're just talking about a third of it is like 6 companies, right? So that's what I mean by the game of chicken, is like everyone is sort of paralyzed. They know what they need to do. They need to diversify. But when you look in the rearview mirror and you see that everything else is stunk, that's a very difficult thing to do. I would just say very quickly, Vani, on rates, I am not, I know the forecast. I have to take the other side. I just don't see the Fed moving to cut rates in a meaningful way anytime soon. And just very quickly, I'll say that because...
When you say anytime soon, do you mean until September or even beyond?
Well, here's what I would say. Look at what they did in 2021. In 2021, in the spring, that's when inflation started to tick up. They did nothing until the fall, when it looked like it was a pattern. They still did nothing. What they did was they started messaging that hikes were coming. They didn't hike until a year later. If you look at this Fed, if you look at that record and you look at what they're saying, I think you have to believe them. And I think what they're saying to you is we are not going to even talk about moving until we see a sustained inflation rate that's near our target. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we're at least 6 months out from aggressive talk. And I think you're probably another 6 months out from action. That's the way I read this Fed.
Wow, okay.
Sounds like there's a column in there somewhere near.
I hope so.
Okay. Near's also a Bloomberg opinion columnist, so look for a column there. I'm not his editor, though, I should note. Hey, Jeff, Near was talking about diversification, and I do want to get to a couple of your stock picks in the last couple of minutes that we have with you. You argue Broadcom AVGO is a place to go, up 53% so far this year. And then outside of the U.S., even though Near said some of the markets have stunk outside of the U.S., Orange and Vodafone Group are 2 of your picks. Make your case.
Yeah, real quick on Broadcom, right? I think what you're seeing is just an incredible spending race in the world of AI. But what you're not seeing is the use case come through. What you're not seeing is a focus on broad enterprise solutions that really can change the world. And so as that use case is forced to come to fruition in a world with higher rates and more choices, I think that's really where you continue to see the strength from companies like Broadcom. So you don't have to just play NVIDIA. You can play a little bit broader as the world of AI broadens out. As we do look internationally, the world of income is back, and the world of dividend-paying stocks is back. And so as we look at companies like Orange and some of the other telecoms abroad, as well as some of the financials in the Eurozone, really the compelling case is that you're earning a 6-7% dividend along the way, and you have the potential for equity upside. But I do want to touch on one more thing, and that's really just the world of rates. I completely agree the Fed shouldn't cut rates, but the question is whether they do. And so the market is very, very focused and almost out of necessity needs rate cuts, but I think that we all should be questioning whether those come to fruition.
Nir, we are awaiting President Biden, who's going to be making a speech at a campaign rally in Madison, Wisconsin. The focus certainly on politics, front and center over the last week, for a lot of people who wouldn't normally be paying so much attention this early in the presidential race, or this late, depending on how you're looking at it, depending on how you define it. How could some sort of major hiccup with the Democratic ticket change the way you're thinking about markets, thinking about investing?
Tim, I have an answer that is quite boring on this. I think in general, my baseline proposition for you is that markets don't care about politics.
Really?
I will. Yeah, I know. I will be the first to concede that politics has been injected into the business environment and therefore, at least implicitly, into markets more, probably more today than at any point in my lifetime. But still, at the end of the day, I think markets ultimately care about earnings. And we've been talking about concentration here. And I think the fact that there's so much concentration inside the market tells you that you really have to draw a straight line between the politics and these particular companies in order to see any real movement in the market. And I just don't see that happening.
What about a corporate tax rate that gets moved lower or higher as a result of who wins the election?
So I think that is a real possibility for moving markets. I think the question is going to be whether markets believe that anybody can really do anything meaningful in this gridlock environment about that. And I think markets will give you the answer. My guess, if you want my guess is that markets are not going to take that proposition seriously, and you're not going to see them moving on that basis. But if they do, I'll be the first to say, here's a move, and they're moving because they're afraid there's going to be real changes in the tax laws.
So you think things like tariffs won't move markets in a fundamental way, or immigration, for example, any movement on immigration, or any extension or lack of extension to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, for example?
I don't think so. And here's what I would propose as evidence for that: is you look at the immigration policies under Trump, and then you look at the immigration policies under Biden, and you really can't imagine a bigger difference in those policies. And yet, if I said to someone, okay, now point to me where that pivot in those policies can be traced into movements in the market, it would be very difficult to do. I mean, the whole time it's just been a huge bull market, almost uninterrupted, barely interrupted by the pandemic, maybe for a few weeks. And so I don't think we can look at that record and say there's really been any meaningful movement. So I wouldn't expect it going forward.
Hey, Jeff, come on back in here and weigh in on this. Do you agree with Nir that politics and markets are not as inextricably bound as many people assume?
You know, in the medium term, I do agree that they're not completely bound. But in the short term, this market's relatively boring. And kind of what we've been talking about is it's really only a few companies that are moving the daily gyrations. And it's basis points and rates that we're debating here. And that's really what's moving markets. And so I guess my concern is we're at that stretch point. The rubber band is stretched so tight that really anything that markets aren't expecting has the ability to interject significant volatility. And so as it relates to President Biden versus potential re-President Trump, or an entirely different ticket, I think it can move markets. I think it will move markets. And Trump probably isn't as good this time around for markets.
Well, speaking of that, the current president, is making his way to the podium in Madison, Wisconsin. I do want to make sure to thank Jeffrey Kleinhofer, co-head of investment at Thornburg, $44 billion in assets under management. Also, Bloomberg Opinion's Nir Kaysar. He's a columnist who covers markets for Bloomberg Opinion. He's also the founder of Unison Advisors, an asset management firm. Let's go now to Madison, Wisconsin, where we hear from President Biden.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, Wisconsin. I gotta thank somebody. Gaylord Nelson, I'm back. He first introduced me to Wisconsin a long time ago when I was a kid. I'm only 40 now, but I was a kid. Sabrina, thank you for the introduction and for the volunteering for our campaign. And a special thanks to one of the best governors I've ever worked with in my life, Tony Evers. You've got a former governor, Jim Doyle, Madison Road, mayor of this city. And look, we got a guy who has a tough time winning an election. He only gets 70% of the vote, Congressman Mark Pocan. And so many local leaders who did, including the chair of Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wickler. Ben. Oh, Ben. Folks, did you have a good 4th of July? By the way, if you wonder whether Trump has it all together, did you ever hear how he explained the 4th of July when he was president? No, I'm serious. This is true. His explanation how America won the Revolutionary War, I'm not making this up. He said in his 4th of July speech 5 years ago, he said, George Washington's army won the revolution by taking control of the airports from the British. To talk about me misspeaking, airports of the British in 1776. It's true, he is a stable genius, this man. My friends, I'm in Wisconsin for one reason, because we're going to win Wisconsin again. We're going to win it. And let me tell you how we're going to do it. You know the reason. We're going to do it because of you all in this room to start with. But we're going to stand up for women in America. We're going to restore Roe v. Wade, the law of the land. We're going to stand up for the right to vote again. We're going to fight for Medicare and Social Security and child care, elder care, paid leave, all which grows economies. We're going to keep lowering the cost of prescription drugs and expanding health care for everyone. Look, we're going to protect our children from getting weapons of war off our streets. That's what we're going to do. The idea that more children die from gunshot wounds in America is so wrong. It's sick. It really is sick. We're going to keep confronting climate change. The most important, we're going to save our democracy. Now, you probably heard we had a little debate last week. Can't say it was my best performance. But ever since then, there's been a lot of speculation. What's Joe going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? What's he going to do? Well, here's my answer. I am running and going to win again. Because we're going to go. Folks, I'm the sitting president of the United States of America in no small part because of you. Not a joke. In 2020, you came through for me. I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party. I'm the nominee of this party because millions of Democrats like you just voted for me in primaries all across America. You voted for me to be your nominee. No one else. You, the voters did that. And despite that some folks don't seem to care who you voted for, well, guess what? They're trying to push me out of the race. Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I'm staying in the race. I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020. Well, by the way, we're going to do it again in 2024. I learned long ago, when you get knocked down, you get back up. And I'm not letting one 90-minute debate wipe out 3.5 years of work. As the governor said, I've led this nation from the depths of pandemic to the strongest economy in the world, and that's literally true. And I and you are not finished yet. Now, you probably also noticed a lot of discussion about my age. I know I look 40. I keep seeing all those stories about I'm being too old. Let me say something. I was too old. I wasn't too old to create over 15 million new jobs. To make sure 21 million Americans are insured under the Affordable Care Act. To beat Big Pharma, the first one ever to do that, and lower the cost of insulin to $35 per figure. Was I too old to relieve student debt for nearly 5 million Americans and grow the economy? Too old to put the first black woman on the Supreme Court of the United States of America? To sign the Respect for Marriage Act? Was I too old to sign the most significant gun safety law in 30 years? To pass the biggest climate bill in the history of the world, not here, the history of the world. But then my critics say, sure, but he did all that. But that was in the past. What about now? Well, how about the 200,000 jobs we announced yesterday? So let me ask you, what do you think? You think I'm too old to restore Roe v. Wade to law of the land? You think I'm too old to ban assault weapons again? To protect Social Security and Medicare? To get child care, elder care for working families in needed nations? To make billionaires finally start to pay something beyond 8.2% of the tax rate? Let me ask you, you think I'm too old to beat Donald Trump? I can hardly wait. Anyway, folks, let's focus on what really matters. We're running against the biggest liar and the biggest threat, no, really, the biggest liar and biggest threat to our democracy in American history. That's not hyperbole. Over 150 presidential historians voted him the worst president in American history. No, the worst. As I've said before, he has the morals of an alley cat. He lies about the economy he created. The truth, he's one of only 2 American presidents who left office with fewer jobs than when he came into office. You know what the other one was? Herbert Hoover. Fact. That's why I call him Donald Herbert Hoover Trump. He lies about the pandemic he totally botched. The truth is, over 1 million people went on to die. He told us what? To inject bleach in our arm. It wasn't serious. He lied about how great he was for veterans in his administration. The truth, he called veterans who gave their lives serving America, and I was just in Normandy and on the beaches of Normandy and all through that area. And he said, I have trouble saying this because my son died as a consequence of Iraq. Who gave their lives, he called them, quote, suckers and losers. By the way, I'll be damned. I'm glad I wasn't with him because I'll be damned to let him talk about my son that way. That's right. But how do we know he said this? That I'm not making this up. A 4-star Marine general, his own former chief of staff was with him, and he told us that's what he said. But he's not the only former Trump official warning us about how bad Trump is. Secretary of Defense and even his own vice president, they refused to endorse him. It says a lot about who Trump is and says a lot about what he isn't. By the way, I couldn't ponder, I guess I shouldn't say it. By the way, I couldn't be prouder to have your support and the support of our great Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Trump is a convicted felon, found guilty, 34 felonies, trying to hide hush money payments to a porn star. Another jury found Trump sexually assaulted a woman in a public place and has been fined $90 million for defaming her. $90 million. They've only been bankrupt about 20 times, but I don't know. This so-called great businessman owes over $400 million in fines. after being convicted in New York State of business fraud, already convicted, fined $400 million. Donald Trump isn't just a convicted criminal. He's a one-man crime wave. But Trump's biggest lie of all is he had nothing to do with the insurrection of January 6th. We all saw with our own eyes. We saw he sent thousands to attack the Capitol. We saw police being attacked, the Capitol being ransacked, the mob hunting for Nancy Pelosi, gallows set up to hang Mike Pence. Let me ask you something. After what Trump did on January 6th, why would anyone ever let him be near the Oval Office again? Folks, the issue of this election is, what kind of America do we want to be? What kind of America do we want to be? Do we want to be a country of anger, revenge, and retribution? Or a country of hope and optimism and possibilities, as we've always been? I want a country where women have a right to make their own health care decisions. Trump wants an America where abortion is banned and women are punished. I want an America where health care is a right, not a privilege. Trump wants to throw tens of millions of people who couldn't get insurance any other way than Obamacare off of Obamacare. I want America where the very wealthy begin to pay their fair share. Trump wants to give the very wealthy an additional, last time out when he was president, he gave them a $2 trillion tax cut, creating the largest deficit any president has in one term. Now he's announced he wants another $5 trillion tax cut after already leaving the largest deficit. It's hard to make this up. I want to protect Social Security and Medicare. He wants to cut Social Security and Medicare so he can cut taxes for the very wealthy. I want to ban assault weapons, require universal background checks. You all heard him promise the NRA. He promised the National Rifle Association, I will do nothing about guns. That's what he said. I will do nothing about guns. And he means it. I want January 6th insurrectionists to serve their full prison terms. Trump wants to pardon them. Folks, you can't be pro-insurrectionist and pro-American at the same time. This is so damn serious. You can't love your country only when you win. Look, you've been standing a long time. Let me close with this. Ultimately, the American presidency is about character. The character of the president who holds the job. Because with the immunities the Supreme Court just talked about, it gets down to that. It gets down to that. It's about honesty. It's about the president's decency, integrity. Do they respect people? Or do they incite violence and hate? Can they honor their oath to the Constitution and uphold their oath of office? Well, I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest Trump has failed on every one of these character tests. Every one. And what's worse, the Supreme Court has just ruled that there are virtually no limits on the power of the presidency. I know it sounds bizarre, but that's what they ruled. A frightening decision. According to the extreme majority of the Supreme Court, the president is now above the law. We just celebrated the 4th of July, saying we will not be ruled by a king. And this Supreme Court he appointed proved this new law. It's a dangerous precedent, especially if Donald Trump has returned to the presidency. Just think about it. The second term, this next term, whomever is the president is going to appoint at least 2 new appointees. The second Trump term, where there are no limits. Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor warned us about that in her dissent in that case. Here's what she said. She noted that based on a majority decision, Trump can take out his opponents, physically take them out, take bribes, lead a coup, and be immune to ever being held accountable for it, if he did it while he was president, according to the Supreme Court. I mean, where the hell are we? So he really could become a dictator that he promised to be on day one. For over 2 centuries, America's been a free, democratic nation. And I'll be damned if in the year 2024, just 2 years before our 250th anniversary of as a nation, I'll let Donald Trump take this away. Folks, this is not hyperbole. This race is about our freedom. It's about our democracy. It's about the very soul of America. Are we prepared to fight for that? I know I am, and I will. And folks, I have never been more optimistic about America's future, because the American people are decent, good, honorable. And just remember who in God's name we are. We're the United States of America. I mean, think about it. Think about it in literal terms. And there's nothing beyond our capacity when we stand together. So let's stand together, win this election, and exile Donald Trump politically. God bless you all. May God protect our troops. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And that was President Joe Biden at a campaign rally, Madison, Wisconsin, a crucial swing state, making a lot of jokes and making a lot of points and basically hitting out against anyone who might assume that he won't run for Democratic nominee to be president once again. He said he absolutely will. He's the only one who can beat Donald Trump. So let's bring in host of Balance of Power, Joe Matthew, who's also listening. And Joe, if you were listening to the speech, I mean, he did pretty well.
Well, sure. Depending on what metric you're using here, he was in full voice, not the frog in the throat that we heard at the debate. He was a bit more measured, not speaking too quickly. As we heard, a lot of trouble getting around some of his words last Thursday. It was a bit different now, and sort of the daytime Joe Biden, if you will, that we've become a bit more used to seeing. Better makeup. He had more color in his face. Some of his advisors had been concerned about him looking a little bit pale at the debate, and I think, as we heard from the press secretary earlier this week, he's recovered from his cold that they were blaming a week ago. The real news here, though, is that he said it full-throatedly. I am running, and I am going to win again. He referred to people trying to push him out of the race, suggesting that he doesn't maybe like the conversation that he's been hearing so much, and he did make a nod to Kamala Harris, thanking her for her support here, but he promised to win the state of Wisconsin, which, of course, as we discussed earlier, is key to his winning the White House. And it's not just this rally today. He's going to sit down and do an interview without a script. As you just saw, he was using a teleprompter in a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos, and that's what's going to really get the most scrutiny. We've seen Joe Biden do a lot of rallies. This is not something new, and obviously he needs to be able to do this to run for president here. It's the interview that we turn our attention to next.
Joe, I mean, the message, though, in the last 20 minutes from the president, it was clear from the jokes that he made at the top all the way to the exit music. Tom Petty, I won't back down. The message, absolutely clear. I'm running and I'm going to win again. I'm staying in the race. We're going to beat Trump again in 2024. I'm not letting one 90-minute debate wipe out an entire life's work. He even joked about a stable genius at the top and how President, at the time, former President Trump talked about the 4th of July and airplanes and the Revolutionary War. But again, a teleprompter, not a debate.
Right.
Does it change? Does this type of thing change anyone's mind?
Probably not in this case. I'm sure it was a lot of fun for the president. He had a very supportive and protective crowd there. We even heard somebody yell, lock him up, when he talked about Donald Trump being found guilty on 34 counts. But he brought a sense of humor, Tim, and I think that gives us maybe a little bit of a sense of what we'll see with George Stephanopoulos. When he came out, he said, you know, I hadn't been here since I was a kid. I'm 40 now. Poking a little bit of fun at oneself goes a long way when you're dealing with an issue like this, as opposed to getting getting upset or angry with reporters telling them what they should be doing. I would expect to see that Joe Biden smile when this comes up a couple of times, as we just saw with George Stephanopoulos. Interesting line that we'll see. I bet they tested this quite a bit over the past couple of days, that I'm not too old to create over 15 million new jobs. And he went through all of his accomplishments. I wasn't too old to sign this, or won't be too old, he said, to restore Roe v. Wade. So we got a little bit of a peek into maybe the new stump speech. That might be something we can take away here. And of course, a full-throated message from this president that he is staying in this race and that he plans to beat Donald Trump. Now look, this is going to be the case until it isn't, but it's the first time we've seen him in a situation like this since the debate, and it's an important moment for him.
Bloomberg Balance of Power host Joe Matthew live from Washington, D.C. Joe, we're going to let you get back to everything that you have going on down there in Washington. Well, U.S. hiring and wage growth slowed in June, while the jobless rate rose to its highest level since late 2021. Gus Fauché is chief economist at PNC Financial Services Group, and Gus joins us now. Gus, I want to talk about everything that's happening with the latest economic data, with the payroll figures that we got for the month of June in a second, but we're just coming from hearing from President Joe Biden, and you're chief economist at PNC Financial Services Group. You watch closely who's in power in Washington. How are you thinking about economics and the U.S. election?
I think that no matter what the result is of the presidential election, we're still likely to have gridlock in Washington, with one party controlling the White House and then the other party controlling at least one house of Congress. So I don't think we're likely to see big changes to fiscal policy in 2025. And so therefore, I think that things are going to stay roughly the status quo, which is where we have an economy that is expanding, we have inflation that is slowing, and the big driver of the economy in 2025 is going to be what the Federal Reserve does with interest rates.
Yeah, earlier we heard from Nir Kaysar, who doesn't think that we're going to see an interest rate cut this year. But Gus, we're still priced in for 2 when it comes to the dot plot, and the market pricing in really close to that.
Yeah, no, I think we'll see 2. I think today's jobs report was slower job growth, slower wage growth, a little bit higher unemployment rate. That's the exact kind of jobs report that the Fed wants to see before they cut rates. And I think that we'll continue to get news on inflation that shows that it is slowing. It doesn't need to be at 2% for the FOMC to cut the Fed funds rate. I think we will see further progress on slowing in inflation over the next few months. And that will give the Fed the leeway to cut the Fed funds rate later this year. And in fact, I expect to see 2 cuts in the Fed funds rate in late 2024.
Gus, what changes your view there? Because I know that you write that November and December is when you're expecting cuts, but what data would you have to see to call for an earlier rate cut?
I think we need to see a more substantial slowing in the labor market. I think the inflation data is less important there. But if job growth starts to slow more significantly, or if we see the unemployment rate move up more quickly, then I think the Fed will be more concerned about the state of the economy, the potential for a substantial weakening in the labor market, and then they might cut in September. But I do think that they want to get through the presidential election before cutting. They don't want to be drawn into the politics of this. So unless we see that substantial softening in the job market, I think the Fed holds on until November.
Until November. Well, yeah, except I think that they will push back against the idea that they might be holding off because of the election. They've always said they're completely independent, Gus. But either way, whether it's November, September, or beyond, there will be a cut at some point. Will it be too late? Is there the potential that it's too late, even if that goes against what you think right now? And how much damage would that have done to the economy if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not going to know until 6-9 months from now whether the Fed is too late. That being said, I still think the economic fundamentals look pretty good. We're adding a lot of jobs. We have wages that are now growing more quickly than inflation. Look at consumer spending. Look at how many people are traveling this holiday weekend. I think consumers are overall in good shape. There's no indication of a let up there. And so I think the economy is strong, and I think it can withstand the Fed funds rate staying where it is in the near term. So whether it's September, whether it's November, I don't think that makes a big difference. But I think the Fed does want to cut rates because they are concerned that the longer monetary policy stays contractionary, the greater the potential there is for recession, not in 2024, but sometime in mid or late 2025.
Gus Fauché, Chief Economist at PNC Financial Services Group. Thanks so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. Really do appreciate it. We are just a couple of minutes away from the closing bell on this holiday shortened week. The NASDAQ and the S&P 500 trading right now at records, Vani. We're at our best levels of the day.
Can you believe it? We made it into the second half and we have a rally on our hands again. It's exactly what
March
Bespoke
continues higher.
Yeah, and it's what Bespoke said. The Wednesday and the Friday of this week, if July 4th is a Thursday, are higher.
Yeah, good point. Look at that. The NASDAQ up 1% right now. The Dow up 0.2%. The S&P 500 up 0.6%. Coming up next, we're going to bring you the closing bell. This is Bloomberg Markets.
Recent years, you created an institute, the Jane Goodall Institute, and what is that designed to do?
Well, that started in 1977 when by then I had a little research station and 4 of my students were kidnapped and everything shut down. And so some friends of mine said, well, let's start an institute so that this research can carry on. Bless them. So that was 1977, and it was set up to study, conserve chimpanzees and other animals and educate. And it's developed since then. So it's, we've got 27 Jane Goodall Institutes around the world. And then I realized at some point that the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitats right across Africa were struggling to survive. There was crippling poverty, lack of health and education, moving deeper into the forest, being exposed to diseases like Ebola and HIV from the chimpanzees and vice versa. It hit me. If we don't help these people to find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, conservation won't work.
Power, money, culture. As Linda Ammon tells the story of Asia's rise through the people who are helping to shape it. This week, with the drive of winning over a new generation of fans and players, Live Golf CEO Greg Norman is shaking up the game.
The best players in the world, on the best golf courses in the world, in the best cities in the world. It's very easy to get that multiplying factor to move out.
Latitude, encore presentation this weekend, only on Bloomberg. The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
What I can say is that we've been making significant investments across the franchise, across regulatory reporting, across data, and across resolution and recovery planning. These are areas we've been investing in because we know they're areas that, frankly, the industry likely needs to further enhance, and we certainly want to enhance them for ourselves.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday at 9 a.m. only on Bloomberg.
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
I couldn't have been more wrong.
It's going to stay volatile for a while longer.
It's a bifurcated market.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Year over year, you could start to see some cracks.
It might be overhyped short term, but it's underhyped long term.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
A lot of the doom and gloom has been somewhat overblown.
If you're not living near the edge, you're taking up too much space.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight, with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Well, there it is, an end to a holiday-shortened trading week with a rally. Stocks finishing pretty close to their best levels of the day. All-time highs for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ composite. Still waiting for things to get settled, but it does look like the Dow finishing higher by just close to 0.2%. The S&P 500, which again finished at a record today, higher by more than half a percentage point, 55.67. The Nasdaq Composite, 18,352, higher by 0.9%. Another record for the Nasdaq.
A 34th record.
I was hoping you'd say the number because after 31, I forgot.
I'm surprised there's even that many trading days in the year so far. I mean, it feels like we are halfway through, but like, could there really have been 34 records? I mean, whatever. There's only one recent record. Anyway, let me take you through IMAP, the map function, which tells us what sectors did well today, what sectors didn't do so well. If you look at it, it's really most sectors did extraordinarily well, apart from energy, industrials, financials. Don't forget, we start getting the big bank earnings next Friday, so that's something else to look forward to. Financials taking off about 0.3% today after that jobs data and the idea that interest rates came down just a little bit. Communication services, best performing sector, up about 2.75%. That was mostly thanks to Meta, which ended the session up almost 6%. Must have been that Twitter, that tweet, that X post made by Mark Zuckerberg's team yesterday of him wakeboarding, of course. And then some of the chip stocks did so well today, but then others didn't. So it was really quite a confusing day. But then markets did have an awful lot to react to, from that data during the week to the data this morning.
Wake surfing and drinking a beer. And holding an American flag.
All at once.
All at once. That's how Mark Zuckerberg spent his 4th of July. Hey, let's take a look at how yields ended the day. We saw yields lower across the curve. The yield on the 2-year down more than 10 basis points. We saw the yield on the 10-year down 8 basis points at 4.27%. And the yield on the 30-year note down 5 basis points.
Well, I can't wait to ask our guests about this because Dennis DeButcher is with us, President and Chief Market Strategist at 22V Research. And of course, Jess Menton is in studio with us, Bloomberg's Jess Menton, whom we all know and love. Jess, let me briefly ask you first, I mean, am I right? Is it really a 34th record for the S&P 500? And have we now started off the second half on a theme that's going to take us right through the second half?
Right, I'm glad you brought up the numbers because through the first half, Tim was just talking about how there were 31 records the first half of the year. And that actually was the second best if you're looking at the pace of records through the first half of the year this century. I had a chart article that I had put out last week and leading into this week about that. So that's some size and scope there. But usually when you have a strong first half like that and you have the S&P 500 gain at least 10%, usually there's a median gain of also 10% in the second half of the year. Obviously, there's different caveats. We are in an election year. Sometimes there's seasonality that comes into play there. But there's actually a lot of different catalysts that could happen over the next three and a half weeks that Tim and I actually were talking about a couple days ago. Over the next 18 trading sessions, you have Fed Chair Jerome Powell on Capitol Hill Tuesday, Wednesday next week. You have CPI next Thursday. You do have earnings season getting into full swing with the big banks like JP Morgan next Friday. And then, of course, we'll have a number of other data points. We'll have big tech earnings later this month. And then on July 31st, that's when we'll have the next Federal Reserve decision. So obviously hearing from the man himself, Fed Chair Jerome Powell, at that time as well. But all eyes on Powell obviously next week. And the only real difference between what we heard from him earlier this month, whenever he was with Christine Lagarde speaking in Europe, is we had the jobs report this week. So I don't feel like when I'm speaking with my sources, they don't think there's going to be any sort of significant change in his tone because it tends to be a lot more political when he goes on Capitol Hill. So he'll probably reintegrate kind of what he was saying before. Usually he'll speak at 10 a.m. Washington time on Tuesday as well as on Wednesday. But usually you get those announcements and what his pre-remarks will be 2 hours before in pre-market trading. So around probably 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, we'll hear what he has to say.
Well, let's bring in Dennis on this one because, Dennis, I'm curious, you know, if we've had that many records so far, do we continue having records? Do we continue to see money pouring into U.S. equities too?
I would imagine no. That's a heroic statement in the world. I would imagine the things that are driving this equity market higher, which is extreme safety trades, you could see some rotation out of, and obviously higher indices along with that. You could see some rotation out of that if we in fact avoid a recession, economic growth stabilizes, and financial conditions ease meaningfully, which seems like the trade of the next 6 months. That you would see some rotation into some of the indices that have lagged, which would theoretically at least slow the advance at the S&P. But I mean, with low conviction, I would say, yes, you should see some slowing in returns, but everything is risk positive right now unless you want to make a very credible case that a recession is around the corner, which we think is just too hard to make.
Dennis, one question that I've had for over a year at this point has been, what happens to money market assets when the Fed cuts rates and when rates do come down. Kind of got lost in the holiday, but money market assets climbed to a record $6.15 trillion, according to ICI data. Where does that money go, and when does it start moving?
I mean, it starts moving once the Fed starts cutting. Theoretically, it shifts out on the curve, right? So you should start to see the yield curve steepen. As the yield curve steepens, short rates come down faster than long rates. That money would move out on the yield curve. And then presumably into riskier assets. It was kind of what I was getting at when I said broadening out of the indices from, say, super quality to, say, small caps or high yield or things of that, companies with debt risk. All of those should theoretically do better or be a receiver of those funds when the Fed starts to cut. This all under the premise that, of course, it's a non-recessionary cutting cycle.
Jess, come on in on this. How are your sources thinking about all the trillions of dollars that are in money markets right now?
Well, that's a great point, because I was actually working on a story about this recently to see where the yields typically were on average over the last 30 years whenever there is a cutting cycle. And probably not surprisingly, because a lot of those cycles were very aggressive rate cuts. If you thought about during the dot-com bubble bursting, if they're during the housing crisis, or say during the pandemic. So you had an excessive amount of rate cuts that would happen, and usually the average point where yields would be were around 2%. So we are far from that. And it's a little bit different now, because when you think about the economy, even though the latest Atlanta Fed GDP now figures for the second quarter, they're hovering around 1.5%, 1.7% roughly, coming down from where it had been about 3% just a mere few weeks ago. But we still haven't gotten all of the June data yet, and that can be a volatile number. So it's going to be interesting to see the next few weeks if that number and the data keep going higher or lower, or if it stays roughly the same depending on what the data in June looked like. Because remember, a lot of that CPI data that had been sticky, we saw some improvements in some of those numbers recently, so it'll be interesting to see how that flows through there. But to your point, Tim, when it comes to money market funds, it's kind of a question of, if you don't have those aggressive cuts, which why necessarily would you need to if the economy is in a good spot, that might prevent a mass amount of money. If you're thinking about where does the money go, if it's in money market funds to equities, it might not necessarily be a dramatic pace there. And also Bank of America has pointed this out before. Usually on average it takes about a year before you see that starting coming out. So I think the question would be like, what does the rate cut picture look like, and how that would feed into what the story would be for money market funds.
You know, at this rate where we are, had 55.67 on the S&P 500, Julian Emanuel's 6,000 forecast, which sort of raised eyebrows a few weeks ago, really isn't looking that far away. Most of the forecasts are for just a tiny bit of upside from here, and several are for some downside. So let me ask you, Dennis, what would you be buying now, given that today we're in the second half and the best performer was Meta Platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I would be sticking with broadly cyclicals over defensives. That's been working. And then from there, I would be thinking very hard about regional banks. I would be thinking very hard about some energy names. I'd be thinking very hard about material names or deeper cyclicals in general. That's based on the idea that, yes, economic growth has slowed. But just keep in mind that if it stabilizes here, which we have high conviction that it will, and the Fed is going to be easing financial conditions, which looks increasingly more obvious by the second, then the medium-term growth outlook will improve, meaning your next year on economic growth. And that tends to favor deeper cyclicals. Now, you're going to need to see some confirming data, like economic surprises, stabilizing, things of that nature. But I do believe that is the next trade. I don't necessarily think we're going to be chasing early cyclicals up here when you're already down to 1.5% on Atlanta Fed, which was already mentioned, and surprises are at the lows. So I think that's the next trade. Retail sales will be critical in thinking about that, and other high-frequency data points. But that's the area that I'd be looking for right now to play for a little bit of mean reversion.
You're saying then that the laggards will lead us to new highs from here, but that's still, that's a bold call, right? I mean, if you're actually going to put your money where your mouth is, it would be tough to sell out of those chip stocks and buy some of those laggards right now, would it not?
Well, I would, let me clarify that. I would, I have a tattoo somewhere on my back about never short monopolies. So I would not be...
Pick or it didn't happen.
Yeah, Bonnie went there. I love it.
So I would not be short those names. Again, I'm thinking more rotate into deeper cyclicals at the expense of defensives, which is, when I say defensives, like Staples, Pharma, et cetera, things that have been a source of funds will continue to be a source of funds. I would say other quality names that are not tech AI related, that are trading at extreme multiples, I would be using those as a source of funds. but there's nothing in the macro backdrop that suggests you should be negative on Meta, right? There's nothing in the macro backdrop right now that suggests the AI CapEx spend is about to fall apart. Maybe that happens at some time in the future. So to be very clear, I think you're looking at those other areas as a place for catch-up, but I would not be short the mega cap tech names against them for reasons stated.
19 stocks in the S&P 500 today, Dennis, hit 52-week highs. They include Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Meta Platforms, Netflix, Oracle, to name just a few of them when you're talking about those mega cap tech names. Hey, Dennis, we're talking about politics today and asking all our guests, too, about political risk, given that there is a lot of drama, I guess you could argue, when it comes to the election come November. How are you looking at political risk, Dennis?
Purely through the lens of will there be a sweep or not? So when I think about political risk, I think about a Liz Truss moment here in the U.S. as it pertains to U.S. Treasury yield, what's going on in France and potential spending. So if there is a sweep one way or the other, where, you know, Trump Republican sweep and you have significant tax cuts, tariffs, et cetera, you have a potential really large issue for U.S. Treasury yields going up a lot. You could say the same on the Democratic side if some of the spending programs were to come to fruition. So that's the lens in which we look at it. When post the debate, there was a clear shift to Trump and Republican sweep odds. U.S. Treasury yields went up a lot, and that created some issues very short term in the market. To the extent that there's more hope now that Biden can beat Trump, that should calm U.S. Treasury yields, at least make it less obvious that a sweep will happen. So that's how we think about it. It really comes down to, will we be spending more money at a time where fiscal orthodoxy is necessary, where it is probably required for the deficit to, at the very least, not grow from here significantly.
Jessamine, is that starting to come up on the radar of the folks that you're speaking to? Political risk when it comes to a lack of gridlock in Washington?
Well, typically what happens if you go back through history during presidential cycles, because a lot of times people like to think about voting with their pocketbooks, whether they're voting for a Republican or a Democrat, but a lot of times it's actually more geared toward gridlock in Congress, because if there's gridlock, it's harder for extreme policy measures to be passed. So say whether you're looking at energy regulation, big tech regulation, healthcare regulation, if you're thinking about clean energy, it's harder for that to happen if there isn't a consensus going on in Congress. So that's actually what traders look for most, whether or not either both chambers will be one-sided or the other. So it's not even just necessarily, I mean, obviously it's a big deal who would be president, but there are a lot of things beyond that traders look at as well, and how that specifically impacts industries in different sectors, and obviously specific stocks too.
Jess Menton. Big thank you to you, Jess Menton from Bloomberg News. And also Dennis DeBuscher, President and Chief Market Strategist over at 22V Research. Thank you as well for joining us on this Friday afternoon. Vani, records almost across the board on the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ.
It's really quite phenomenal. I mean, this year, you know, these stocks can do no wrong. If you had been in them at the beginning of the year, how happy would you be right now? Would you have sold going into the second half? I don't know.
I try not to think about decisions like that.
Me too. On the other side of the coin, though, you do have natural gas at an 8-week low. So there's some, you know, some places in the energy patch where things aren't all that sweet.
Okay, well, look at that. Hey, coming up next, we're sticking on politics because we're going to have the latest on a crucial weekend for President Biden as he prepares to sit down for an interview with ABC News. This is Bloomberg Markets.
Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. From breakfast cereals to pet foods, General Mills has an iconic array of brands. But future success depends on efficiency, innovation, and insight. CFO Kofi Bruce does much more than crunch numbers.
Our first job is to intimately understand and anticipate the consumer's needs.
Watch Chief Future Officer. New episode Wednesday on Bloomberg Television.
People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
The private markets in general have exploded at the expense of the public markets. Part of that's regulatory, part of that's just structural in the market. Private credit particularly exploded when the banks took a step back.
Money, culture. as Linda Aman tells the story of Asia's rise through the people who are helping to shape it. This week, with the drive of winning over a new generation of fans and players, Live Golf CEO Greg Norman is shaking up the game.
The best players in the world, on the best golf courses in the world, in the best cities in the world, it's very easy to get that multiplier factor to move out.
Latitude, encore presentation this weekend, only on Bloomberg. The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
What I can say is that we've been making significant investments across the franchise, across regulatory reporting, across data, and across resolution and recovery planning. These are areas we've been investing in because we know the areas that, frankly, the industry likely needs to further enhance, and we certainly want to enhance them for ourselves.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Probably heard we had a little debate last week. Can't say it was my best performance. But ever since then, there's been a lot of speculation. What's Joe going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? What's he going to do? Well, here's my answer. I am running and going to win again.
Well, they have it. President Biden speaking to supporters at a campaign rally in Madison, Wisconsin just moments ago. Now he's preparing to sit down for an interview with ABC News. Joining us now for more from Washington is Joe Matthew, host of Bloomberg's Balance of Power. Joe, the Madison, Wisconsin event in the president's rearview mirror at this point. How big of a deal and how big of an issue tonight is the focus on the ABC News interview?
Well, this is going to be the real test, or the beginning of a series of tests that we see over the course of the week. Doing a rally like this should not be big news for Joe Biden. Granted, he did say he's staying in the race, okay, but of course he wasn't going to say something different, right, unless he was actually dropping out. You know, I'm thinking about maybe not running in this race. You have to act like you mean it until you don't. And so we're going to go through some stages here. As you mentioned, George Stephanopoulos sits down with him in Wisconsin. That's going to be unscripted as opposed to the teleprompter rally that we saw there. Because a lot of people are still wondering what happened last Thursday night. As he says, he's joking about it. He didn't have the best debate. Well, why not? Was it because he had a cold? The White House also said that he had jet lag, but he had returned from his trip to Europe 12 days before that debate. So surely jet lag couldn't have had a lot to do with it. Was he over-prepared? Does he, in fact, have trouble operating after a certain hour at night? I think that's the kind of stuff that this interview might seek to explore. And you better believe a lot of reporters will be asking him questions like this when he holds his NATO news conference next week. That's going to follow the NATO summit here in Washington with a lot of important meetings that will also test this president in real time.
Yeah, you know, we were joking earlier a little bit about what the opposite or the antonym to kingmaker would be, and who might that be in Washington, D.C. And now the Washington Post is reporting that Senator Warner is leading the effort to get Biden to exit the race. What are you hearing about Congress and the feelings among, among those in the House and the Senate on what Biden should do?
Well, we've all been having a lot of off-the-record conversations with lawmakers while they're out of town. They're going to be coming back to town next week, and Bloomberg has already reported in the past couple of days there could be dozens of Democratic House lawmakers, House members, signing off on a letter to the president asking him to step down. 3 so far are officially on the record, as Congressman Seth Moulton joined that list on the 4th of July in a local interview in Boston. But what's that going to feel like if it is, in fact, dozens who are calling on the president to step down? Clearly, it's a different conversation behind the scenes as well. And while we get this interview under our belts here and see the president performing next week, that's going to help to tell us a lot about the near term. But look, we're probably taking this a week at a time here, because after next week, it's on to Milwaukee and the Republican convention. And I wouldn't expect to hear a lot of decision making from Joe Biden in that period of time unless something very dramatic happens, and we have to allow for that.
Amazing, Joe. Thank you so much. That's Joe Matthew, host of Balance of Power, keeping an eye on all things Biden for us at the moment. And of course, that interview will take place later today. Well, back to the jobs report, because it showed a slowdown in hiring last month, bolstering the prospect of Fed rate cuts potentially this year. Not only that, but many were watching it to see if it would trigger the so-called SOM rule. That rule, of course, being whether the increase in the unemployment rate would be a half point higher than the rise in the unemployment rate, than the lowest number in the continuing unemployment rate for the last 12 months. Well, we'll bring in Claudia Sam, who actually is named after the rule is named after her. I'm getting this all wrong, Claudia. But she's chief economist at New Century Advisors and also Bloomberg opinion columnist. And indeed, even though the unemployment rate went to 4.1%, your rule was not triggered, but only barely, Claudia. What jumps out to you?
Well, first and foremost, we step back. There was a lot of good news in this report. Right? The labor market is in a very good place. We are in a sustainable place, meaning that this is not strength or heat the Fed should look at and say we need the labor market to be weaker, is causing inflationary risk. This is a place we could stay, and it's a really good labor market, right? A 4.1% unemployment rate is historically and objectively a very good unemployment rate. So there's a lot here to celebrate, and we needed sustainability. We needed to get here. That's very good. Now, the thing that the SOM rule and other pieces of data, both in the jobs data, we've gotten other data reports recently like this too, point to, well, there's some softening, right? We needed that moderation. We needed to get back to normal, but it's like, we don't want to go too far south here. And so there are warnings historically with even small increases in the unemployment rate that it can pick up steam and then translate into a recession. The SOM rule is just looking for historically, going all the way back to World War II, what does that kind of look like? What's that threshold for increases? And we are close to what has held up very well in the past. That's not a prediction, ironclad law of nature. It's just historically that's been true in the past, and it is a building weakness that we should keep an eye on, and the Fed should especially keep an eye on.
So what should the Fed should keep an eye on it, you argue, and the Fed should react to it. When do you think the Fed should react so they're not behind the curve?
The Federal Reserve should begin easing as soon as it is possible. July, frankly, is not possible the way the Fed is, or is not likely.
It's possible.
Really the reason, it is. I'm sorry. Yes, everything is possible. No, the Fed should be easy. The Fed was clear from some of the recent inflation data. I think it could be very much confirmed next week. Got head faked by some of the strength early in the year. So there was already a case going to do the cuts. Now, what the Fed should take as the message from this today is, one, you do not have a strong labor market. The labor market no longer needs to ease to get your inflation down, and you cannot use it as an excuse to wait. Right, we have the luxury of time. That they don't have that anymore. They need to do on the merits of the data. My read is it's time to cut. My read of the Fed is they will cut in September, not July.
If it should be July and it goes to September or beyond, November potentially, Claudia, then how much damage could the Fed do to the economy by not moving in July?
You have to remember with the Federal Reserve, their policy tools act with a lag. And so it will take time, and honestly, it's hard to predict about how all of that goes forward. They have an opportunity, the sooner they act, to start easing, or put differently, when we think about all the different parts of the economy we have seen come back into some better form of balance, including inflation. The federal funds rate is really the last piece that has showed no signs of normalization yet. So the Federal Reserve can get into this process and get in sync with the economy. The sooner they do that, the better. And the longer they wait, these are risks. Like, I'm not predicting a recession right now. I am not predicting that the Federal Reserve brings down the economy. I'm saying it's time to get going because we want to do this gradually, responsibly. And the sooner you do that, the more likely it will be to pull that off in a much more smooth, non-disruptive way.
But Claudia, does the Fed find itself between a rock and a hard place with the election in November, and a September Fed cut could look political or too political to some observers, open it up for criticism?
The Fed is not a partisan institution. I take them very much at their word, both having worked at the Fed and with these Fed officials previously. They have a hard enough job to not bring in like the politics of who wins or who loses and what policies. I think the issues that they're having right now, they're confidence issues about inflation. These go to demons of the past in the 1970s, the Fed making decisions, or in 2021. I really do not think this has to do with politics. Now, they will get blamed from all angles, no matter what they do. And yet the Fed knows that that's just how this works. So I'm not worried about that piece.
Claudia, always love it when you join us. Thanks so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Markets on this Friday afternoon. That's Claudia Sahm, Chief Economist at New Century Advisors, also an opinion columnist for Bloomberg Opinion.
And, I feel like I did as bad of a job there as I would have if I tried to explain the offside rule. So I want to repeat. I was so
glad you got that assignment. Go ahead, please.
It historically indicated a recession. It's now at 0.43 percentage points versus its 0.50 percentage point trigger. So we're 7 basis points away from the trigger. I just had to get that in there.
Vonnie.
It's not the offside rule.
The best. Thank you for doing that. Hey, coming up next on Bloomberg Markets, we're going to check in on the path of Tropical Storm Beryl as it slams into Mexico after leaving a trail of destruction through the Caribbean. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday at 9 a.m. only on Bloomberg.
The top names in tech are on Bloomberg.
I don't like anthropomorphizing AI. I sort of believe it's a tool. It is got intelligence, if you want to give it that as, moniker, but it's not the same intelligence that I have.
I especially am afraid of whenever it's some kind of AI is speaking for me. I want to be myself, and I want to be the one speaking. I have AI myself, actual intelligence.
This industry of producing intelligence is one of the greatest opportunities I've ever seen. Instead of instruction-driven computing, it's now intention-driven computing.
There's been a lot of us who've been working in AI for a long time. It's great now to see other people using it and seeing what some of the challenges are.
To stay ahead in tech, it has to be much more than just software. So you need long-term investments in science and research.
You have an ecosystem of companies coming together. It's causing a new industrial revolution.
Nobody covers technology like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. A lot's happening on Wall Street.
I couldn't have been more wrong.
It's going to stay volatile for a while longer.
It's a bifurcated market.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
Year over year, you could start to see some cracks.
It might be overhyped short term, but it's underhyped long term.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
A lot of the doom and gloom has been somewhat overblown.
If you're not living near the edge, you're taking up too much space.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. From breakfast cereals to pet foods, General Mills has an iconic array of brands. But future success depends on efficiency, innovation, and insight. CFO Kofi Bruce does much more than crunch numbers.
Our first job is to intimately understand needs.
Watch Chief Future Officer. New episode Wednesday on Bloomberg Television.
People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
The private markets in general have exploded at the expense of the public markets. Part of that's regulatory, part of that's just structural in the market. Private credit particularly exploded when the banks took a step back.
Well, Beryl is weakening after pummeling Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Now a tropical storm, but it left a trail of destruction through the Caribbean that may reach $5 billion in damage. Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Will Wade. He's here in our Bloomberg studio. Will, from your purchase as someone who covers energy markets, who covers energy, and specifically nuclear energy, how are you watching a storm like this?
Well, we always watch hurricanes when they go through the Gulf to see what happens to oil and gas production, because so much of those platforms in the Gulf of Mexico can be affected by these storms. So right now, we're watching Beryl, and it's heading northwest, and we think it's going to hit southern Texas or maybe the northeast corner of Mexico sometime Sunday night into Monday. But if the track turns, and they they change directions all the time. If it goes more north-north, that'll take it straight through the Gulf and the oil production areas. So that's a big threat.
And it's going to be a very active year for hurricanes. We've known that for some time, but we may not see the type of reaction that you might have come to expect from particular markets, like, for example, oil or natural gas. Having a hurricane doesn't necessarily mean that the price will go up and the supply down.
Well, they've been watching these things come through for decades. When the storms come, they shut the platforms down. When the storms pass through, they get them right back going. So it depends on whether or not they hit the refineries. When they hit the platforms, they get those production going again. But if a storm knocks out a refinery, that can affect production for a while.
Will, it's remarkably early for us to be talking about a storm such as this.
Oh, absolutely.
Strength.
Yeah, so today's Friday, but as of Monday, it reached Category 5 strength. That was the first time we've seen any storm get to Category 5 in, this early in the season, in records going back for years and years and years. And this is all a climate change thing.
Yeah, explain that to us, because people in the Caribbean and people in very many areas have been experiencing these constantly, and how are they worse now because of climate change?
Oh, it's simple: warm water. So our weather reporter Brian Sullivan, that I've been learning at his knee for years, as he always said, is like warm water is like jet fuel for hurricanes, and it just supercharges them. And with climate change, we've got warming oceans. So as of, what was it? I think it was in May, they were saying the waters in the Gulf were the temperature that they usually get to in August, just because that heat collects in them. So warmer water fuels the hurricane, makes it stronger, dumps more rain, more damage.
Yeah, we always note that, weather is not climate and climate is not weather, but the two are certainly bound to one another in ways. Will, does it mean, and I hate to draw too much from one storm, and from one instance of water being warmer this early in the year, but is this the new normal? Are we going to start seeing hurricane season start this early?
Maybe.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah, I can't be definitive on that, but we know the planet is getting warmer, the water is getting warmer. This is kind of how it works. Now, I'm not the meteorologist, I'm not the expert, but I've been watching these for years. So my unofficial prediction is, yeah, you're exactly right.
It is a La Nina year, though, right? And that sort of makes a difference?
The La Nina, El Nino things totally affect weather patterns. And in fact, I'm hearing that it's making cooler waters in the Pacific, so it's not going to be as big a threat there. But we are seeing, the warm water here out in it's the Gulf, but they call it the Atlantic storm area.
Wow, fascinating.
Because they come off the Atlantic.
Well, it's one of those areas where, at least markets, shut. Most markets shut at 4 p.m. on a Friday, at the very latest, right? The weather never stops, so Will Wade never stops working. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Will Wade for joining us. And we want to continue with this subject now and bring in more insight with Jim Romer, who's publisher of the Weather Wealth Commodity newsletter. And of course, he advises hedge funds, also farmers and commodity traders who need to be able to tell the future to the extent that you can in order to protect themselves and hedge these markets. So, Jim, talk to us about this particular hurricane, now tropical storm, and the season that's likely to be. Does it mean that all commodity prices will rise?
Well, first of all, as Wade, just to reiterate what he was saying, absolutely climate change is a factor. Not La Nina right now, which I think won't form actually till the late fall or winter. And just to recap real quickly, the last hurricane that hit the Houston area, this storm looks like it'll go toward Galveston and come up the coast closer to Houston, was in 2017. It wiped out refineries with 40 inches of rain. The price of crude oil actually went down because demand was weakened. And that's one reason why you're seeing natural gas prices soften. development. Really not having an effect on the platforms and rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. Those are much further east. And also a cooler period recently in the Midwest has also pressured natural gas. So anyway, I expect this storm to re-intensify on Monday and perhaps go up the coast. Could be an explosive development once again to at least a Category 2 by Monday.
Yeah, so, wow, fascinating. I mean, that's the energy markets, right? So you're saying these days, at least for the natural gas market, it impacts demand more than supply, and so that's why we see the price go down to crazy lows when we see a weather event that you might anticipate would send gas higher. Not so much the case maybe for crude oil, but what about soft commodities, things like, whatever gets planted in these areas, and I'm sure it depends on what state you're talking about, but I mean, do whole crop seasons get ruined?
Not really. I mean, typically hurricanes are affecting some of the equity markets. Bond prices can be hit in certain areas where there's exposure to climate and hurricane risk. Stocks like Generac, for example, the battery company for regenerating batteries, those stocks tend to go up. Home Depot, things like that. As far as commodities go, right now what I'm looking at is a drought developing in the Ukraine that may help the wheat market rally, which has been in the doldrums, and also some of the bearishness I see in commodities right now with La Nina forming later on this year is perhaps in markets like sugar and cocoa that have major bull markets because of climate change and El Nino destroying crops this last year. We could look at an increased production for those commodities. So from a soft commodity perspective, this is more of an energy play. Everybody thinks it's bullish energies. Well, if we have one after another in Louisiana and the Central Gulf, yes. But in the Southwest Gulf near Texas, this actually hurts demand and can actually weaken crude oil and natural gas prices, which we saw happen today.
Hey, Jim, I want to go back to something that you said earlier when you were talking about our guest Will Wade earlier and the effect of climate change. You've been doing this for 35 years. I'm wondering if you can speak to any data that you've seen in recent years that has made your job different as a result of the climate shifting.
Certainly has. I mean, we've seen multiple hurricanes go from a Cat 1 to a Cat 5 within 24 to 36 hours. Never happened in history. Absolutely, the climate has been warming. And this makes some of the computer models that we have wrong at times. So I have my own in-house climate predict program that I've been using and developing with a friend from MIT that takes into account climate change and tries to project weather 6 months to 9 months in advance for commodity traders and farmers all over the world. So, I'm always learning things every single day. Chaos theory, climate change, things are always changing. And, we just have to keep one step ahead of this for our clients because the weather's just become so extreme, not only here in the United States, but all over the world.
Where are you seeing the most extreme weather right now? Like what parts of the world are you seeing that?
It's incredible. Obviously with the war in Ukraine going on, the last thing they want is a drought. And it's a little bit too late to really adversely affect the wheat crop, but there still may be some repercussions in the wheat market from the psychology of dry weather in Ukraine. We've seen particularly coffee along the equator, problems with Vietnam's crop over the last 2 years, droughts in northern Brazil, the Amazon being depleted. Some of the tropical commodities, coffee, has certainly been affected, and the grain market right now is kind of on edge, whether we're going to have droughts in the Midwest this summer. Right now, crops are pretty good. I'm watching this very closely for clients. Will that heat and dryness affect the corn and soybean market? We've been in a bear market really for the last year. That's something I'm trying to figure out right now that could happen deeper into the summer. Parts of the Midwest turn hot and dry.
You're down there in Florida, Jim, and every time we speak, we talk about orange juice and orange juice futures and so on. And, you tend to think of cocoa prices and so on. I'm not sure how many people, really think about the orange juice market. But where are we at with OJ?
Well, we've had citrus greening, a disease for the last 15 years, which has wiped out 75% of the orange crop here in Florida. So the market really is very much affected by Brazil's weather. We had a drought in Brazil the last few months, and as a result, with tight supplies and more demand post-COVID for orange juice, the healthy alternative, of course, we've seen orange juice prices go over $4, unbelievable. So if we have an active hurricane season and we have one or two hit Florida, we could see higher prices later on. Right now, this jump up in orange juice here recently on the hurricanes is really more psychology than reality. And if we don't have a hurricane hit Florida and we see a rebound in Brazil's orange production next year because of La Nina, then orange juice prices a year from now could be maybe 20% or so lower than where they are right now.
That would be a relief, but not though, I guess, for orange growers, right? They benefit from higher prices. But that's the thing, we get such volatility in commodities markets, and it is all about feelings and forecasts and sort of a reaction. And we were speaking earlier about Joe Biden, and David Weston was saying how important it is for the campaign to realize that they don't need to react quickly. They can wait for something to happen. They can just, be calm. There's no need for like a hydraulic reaction. But that's exactly what commodity markets do. There is this hydraulic reaction immediately when they think something is coming down the pike, right?
It's not like holding Apple or Amazon or NVIDIA. Pitches up several $1,000%. Commodities are so volatile, and 90% of people lose money in commodities because they get in after the fact. What I try to do is try to second guess models when people are long. What's going to make me become bearish a certain commodity, and maybe buy puts or sell calls as opposed to selling futures, which have more risk. When everybody's short a market, like they've been in grains over the last year because of big global crops and poor demand, what can change that? When do people that are short run for the hills? And that's what I kind of try to do in my newsletter, Weather Wealth. I've been doing this for 35 years, but using options is really the safest play in many of these markets, from crude oil, natural gas, to grains and soft commodities.
So, Jim, it raises the question, what do you think the market is getting wrong right now?
What is getting wrong? Well, the markets never lie, do they? I think people expected natural gas prices to soar on a hot summer. We saw natural gas go to $3 3 weeks ago. On the psychology, not reality, that the Midwest and Northeast would have a record hot summer. No, the heat is really out west. Fires decimating potentially the wineries again, maybe affecting some REITs and some bond markets, some city municipalities out in California. So the market was wrong about natural gas. We've had 5 warm winters in a row, a glut of supplies. It's going to take one hurricane after another to eat into supplies in the Gulf of Mexico, and a really, really hot late August, September, and then a cold winter for prices to go back above $3 to $3.50, something that I don't see happening anytime soon.
Jim, what do you think should be on our investing audience's radar that isn't on there right now? What should they be watching for?
Well, the grain market has been in the doldrums, and now we have a drought developing in the Ukraine. The Midwest crops are generally pretty good right now, except for some flooding in the northwest part of Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska. If that turns to hot and dry during the critical pollination and pod setting stage for corn and soybeans over the next 6 to 8 weeks, that's something that is a possible bull market later on. I think from a bearish perspective, we saw chocolate prices, right, cocoa, go to historical levels with over 500% rally, whatever, over the last year and a half. I think with La Nina forming later this fall and winter, being bearish sugar, being bearish some of the tropical commodities is something that I'm looking at longer term. Selling call options, buying puts on rallies. If we see a rebound in global production of soft commodities, is something that's on my radar now for the next 8 to 12 months.
Jim Romer, he publishes the Weather Wealth newsletter. They also call him Dr. Weather.
Dr. Weather.
Dr. Weather, that's what they call him.
You know why?
Can you doctor the weather?
Why do they call you Dr. Weather?
All my friends from college in Vermont won't talk to me. They don't have PhDs. I have a PhD in life because I was doing weather forecasting for like 40 ski resorts from Stowe to Killington and somehow they thought I was good. Maybe they were wrong, but I was pretty accurate 20 years ago forecasting weather for ski areas.
Oh, so it was a serious moniker, and there we were thinking it was all a joke.
Jim Romer, Dr. Weather. Catch him on the slopes.
Down here with sharks. There's sharks down in Florida. There's no snow.
Yeah, exactly.
It's true, though. He needs to doctor this weather.
Catch him on the slopes in Vermont in the winter. He's joining us from Sarasota, Florida. Vani, markets are closed, but a record day on the S&P 500 and for the NASDAQ.
If you didn't sell at the end of the first half, you're quite happy. You're quite happy that you took that risk because the NASDAQ was up 1%, the NASDAQ 100 up 0.9. It continues.
It does. Coming up next, we're talking travel with the Points Guy. This is Bloomberg.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg. Power, money, culture. Linda Aman tells the story of Asia's rise through the people who are helping to shape it. This week, with the drive of winning over a new generation of fans and players, Live Golf CEO Greg Norman is shaking up the game.
The best players in the world, on the best golf courses in the world, in the best cities in the world. It's very easy to get that multiplying factor to move out.
Latitude, encore presentation this weekend, only on Bloomberg. The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
What I can say is that we've been making significant investments across the franchise, across regulatory reporting, across data, and across resolution and recovery planning. These are areas we've been investing in because we know they're areas that, frankly, the industry likely needs to further enhance, and we certainly want to enhance them for ourselves.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal?
Are markets too optimistic?
How do you worry about the things that are outside your control?
How does the current fighting completely stop?
I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday at 9 a.m. only on Bloomberg.
Well, at least 71 million Americans are expected to travel over the July 4th holiday weekend. The TSA warning travelers to expect long waits and crowds at airports. Clint Henderson is the managing editor of The Points Guy. It's an online publication that helps readers find the best deals for flights, hotels, credit cards, and more. Clint joins us now. Clint, we like looking at these TSA figures because it gives us a good idea of the economic health of the consumer. It's just one of the many measures of alternative data that we take a look at to understand how consumers are feeling. What can you tell us from your perch at The Points Guy about how consumers are feeling about discretionary spending?
I mean, things are still going gangbusters. It's really impressive. I think TSA has had 7 of the 10 busiest days ever in the past month. So you see that business demand is finally recovered almost completely. Leisure demand remains very high. We are seeing a few signs of softening in markets like Paris and hotel occupancy in places like Hawaii. But overall, it's still, like, the demand is just there and more. I mean, it's really record-breaking and impressive because it's been going on for years now. I will say this is the first summer in 3 years that I've actually seen deals even this late into the summertime. So if folks haven't booked last-minute trips, there's still opportunities here. I know Air France did a warning because demand has been weaker than expected due to the Paris Olympics. So I think that's a really interesting little data point there. But overall, demand remains strong. A lot of people traveling.
Yeah, it's that counterintuitive thing. You think demand is going to be stronger because of the Olympics. But hey, it's not
Why, because you don't want to go because it's too crowded? Like what? I don't know.
Possibly people who are not interested in the Olympics wouldn't want to go. I'm guessing that's what Clint would say. We'll ask him in a minute. But it could also be the bed bugs, no, Clint?
No, I don't think it's bed bugs. I think it's, a lot of attractions are closed. It's hard to get around. Prices are really high for hotels. So I think there's multiple reasons. But I also think you're starting to see some fall off in the insane levels of demand there was for places like Europe, places like Florida, places like Hawaii. You're starting to see that saturation point may have been reached in some of these places, and so you're starting to see a little bit of weakness.
And are people getting adventurous again? Not that they weren't adventurous before, but it does feel like there was a time when war was everywhere. You couldn't cross a continent without, trying to avoid some kind of airspace. And now it does seem like that's dialed back a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you're still seeing people willing to travel despite the war in Ukraine, hotspots around the world, the Middle East. I think the major U.S. airlines have returned service now to Israel. So you're seeing some recovery around that. But I think the bigger trend is that everyone still wants to travel. Everyone wants to post that selfie in front of the National Monument, the Roman Colosseum, or whatever it is, and that's really driving a lot of the demand too. I think you see these pictures on Instagram, and everybody wants to copy that.
What a world, Instagram, driving travel. But no question, it certainly helps with discovery, I think, Clint. What about Japan? We talk to a lot of folks about travel, and they keep bringing up over and over again Japan. And I mean, not just anecdotally, but we have several producers on our team who've just gotten back from visits to Japan. It seems like everybody's going to Japan.
Here's the thing. Japan has become much more accessible for Americans. I think even a decade ago, it was harder to get around. There wasn't as much English, especially in Tokyo. And I think that's changed. Also, you have to remember how strong the U.S. dollar is. International travel for Americans is so much more affordable now. And I think Japan was one of those places that was closed for a long time during the pandemic. And so once it reopened, you saw this surge of demand, and that demand has not really let up. And again, it's an Instagram magical place, and I was there too this year, so
so you can add that to the list.
I will. But here's the thing: flights to Japan are still really, really expensive. All of Asia, pretty much, still. You have not seen that Chinese market reopen. The number of flights is still down, so Asia remains like a bright spot, I think, with pricing.
Okay, where's the place nobody's going yet, but they should be going, Clint? What's the place where in a few years, you could have gone now and say, I went there before everybody was going there?
I think some of the places that we've seen are like Estonia and Albania, but the word is starting to get out on those places too. For my money, I would rather go where the U.S. dollar is strongest. A place like Turkey that has all the history of Europe and spectacular sights, and you can get a 5-star hotel for $200. To me, that's a destination that's worth pursuing. But I think some of the undiscovered places, Eastern Europe, places that maybe are not first on travelers' lists, like France or Italy, with some of those secondary cities and countries that are off the beaten path a little bit more.
It's a little bit of a controversial destination, but I do feel it's becoming more of a potential destination, and that's Saudi Arabia. Clint, do you see many people booking tourist trips to Saudi Arabia?
So Saudi Arabia is investing so much money into the tourism infrastructure right now. They've made it a little bit easier for people to visit. I still don't hear a lot of people going. I know that the government is really pushing travel writers and everyone else to come and explore it and see it. And they're in fact building a new city from scratch there that looks pretty remarkable. But so far, I do not see a lot of folks going there aside from cultural standpoint and return home standpoint. But that could change. I think Saudi Arabia is, like other Middle Eastern countries, really wanting to get that tourist dollar and to diversify their economy. So it'll be really interesting to watch that space.
And it is interesting to watch and see, what places have to go out of fashion because of politics, such as Russia, for example. People cannot and will not go to Russia, and it's not clear when they ever will again. And then there are other countries like Saudi Arabia where a few years ago it would have been inconceivable, and maybe it's getting less inconceivable. So let me ask you about your tips. When is the best day to book? Has it changed? What credit cards should we get?
So I could go on for an hour about all those things, but I will just give you a few general ones. First of all, there's no perfect time to book a flight, but there are days when it's going to be generally cheaper. If you travel on a Saturday or you travel midweek, you're not competing as much with the business traveler, so you're going to be able to find better deals. If you could go in the shoulder season, where you need a coat to go, so think September, October, November, and then think again in the springtime, there's usually less crowds. It's cheaper to travel during those seasons, and you get the places more to yourself. So I love shoulder season travel as a tip I always tell people. Finally, Google Flights. Google has some amazing tools you can use to find cheap flights. You can do flight trackers. They even have Google Explorer where you put in your home airport and you just hit a button and it shows you the cheapest places you can go all over the world with the push of a button, anywhere from months out to a couple of days ahead of time. So some really cool tools from Google that I love. And then credit cards, oh my gosh. Get a good credit card that has a big sign-up bonus, but if you're just starting out in that, get one that has a transferable currency where you get a big sign-up bonus and then you can transfer those points into different airlines or hotels. I like the Chase cards, and then I transfer them to Hyatt hotels for some amazing redemptions. But there's all kinds of good stuff out there.
Does it seem like, though, the redemptions, the deals have gotten worse, Clint, that you're not able to find value with points the way you were 5-10 years ago?
It's certainly gotten more expensive. Some of the sweet spots have been scooped up, but there are workarounds. So you can still get business class seat on an airline like Air France for 50,000 points. You just have to learn the tools better, and that's why the points guy is so important. We teach you those workarounds because everyone is devaluing. So Delta, American, United.
I just need I need to send Clint my travel plans, and he can help me book something because I can never find these deals anywhere.
Well,
I write about it every week. You have to be really flexible, but it is out there, and there are tools that can help you find
But it's like a reverse stock split or something. I'm terrified that United at some point is going to say, hey, your X thousand miles is now actually only worth X hundred, or it takes twice the amount to actually travel.
That's what happens to me. It's like I try to book something, and it's so high, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's just
it can happen overnight. So that's why we say earn and burn. So you don't sit on those miles because they're not earning you interest. That's for sure. They're only going to go down in value. So get those sign-up bonuses, use them right away.
I guess you could gift them, but
to me,
that's no fun. Yeah.
Anyone who wants to, send them to me.
Clint, thank you so much.
To Japan.
Sounds
yes,
good.
A very cheap Japan. Clint, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure getting all of your tips and tricks, and we will sign up for the Points Guy newsletters to see what's going to come out in the next few months because these things change all the time. That's Clint Henderson of the Points Guy. And Tim, where is your next vacation?
My next vacation is a cycling trip in the west of the U.S.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's coming up in September.
That's very impressive.
I do need to book tickets, though. I haven't done that.
Oh, my gosh. So what happens? Do you bring a bicycle in those instances?
Yeah, I'm going to bring a bike in this case.
Sports vacation?
Yeah,
Is that
it'll
even
be fun.
is
It's
that
with
an
my dad.
oxymoron?
It'll be fun. He's doing a big trip from Montana to New Mexico.
Wow. And you're talking about a pedal bike, not a motorbike, right?
Yeah,
wow.
pedal bike.
It's even
So I'm going to
more
go join him
impressive.
in Colorado for the last 10 days or so.
That's insane.
Yeah,
Will
should
you have
be
an
fun.
Instagram handle for it?
Oh, yeah, I'll do it. What about you?
I won't have an Instagram handle for anything.
Are you going anywhere fun?
No, I've just been around the Middle East, so we'll talk about that on Monday when markets reopen. Thank you so much for joining both of us from Tim Stanek and myself. Happy 4th weekend.
Liquidity is the lifeblood of an airline. We make very conservative decision making about when we raise funding and how we raise funding. We try to diversify our sources, and we're always very focused on the actual rates. And we like to build in flexibility in these financing structures so that we have an opportunity to prepay debt when appropriate so that we can continue to optimize the overarching rates that we're paying.
What have you learned with the dynamic move of the interest rates that we've seen from Chairman Powell? I mean, do you go fixed structure or floating structure, much more like what they do in Europe?
Yes and yes. We have a mix currently. It's a little bit of a different model than what I was used to in the public company space. Say in some ways we provide ourselves with a natural hedge, leaving some of our debt floating and some fixed.
You have to have the short-term discipline to sort of circle the wagons around cash. I mean, cash is oxygen. I know where every ounce of cash is going, but we also have to be nimble around that as well because things change by the day. I know the folks who aren't willing to invest right now may have large pockets of investment in the future. So I want to be in front of them. They may not be a buyer at this point, but I do want to spend a lot of time in front of that other set that is a buyer at this point. They're interested. They want to be an early adopter of the stock. They're interested in the story.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
I couldn't have been more wrong.
It's going to stay volatile for a while longer.
It's a bifurcated market.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Year over year, you could start to see some cracks.
It might be overhyped short term, but it's underhyped long term.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
A lot of the doom and gloom has been somewhat overblown.
If you're not living near the edge, you're taking up too much space.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live tonight with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. From breakfast cereals to pet foods, General Mills has an iconic array of brands. But future success depends on efficiency, innovation, and insight. CFO Kofi Bruce does much more than crunch numbers.
Our first job is to intimately understand and anticipate the consumer's needs.
Watch Chief Future Officer. New episode Wednesday on Bloomberg Television.
People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
The private markets in general have exploded at the expense of the public markets. Part of that's regulatory, part of that's just structural in the market. Private credit particularly exploded when the banks took a step back.
Money, culture. Linda Aman tells the story of Asia's rise through the people who are helping to shape it. This week, with the drive of winning over a new generation of fans and players, Live Golf CEO Greg Norman is shaking up the game.
The best players in the world, on the best golf courses in the world, in the best cities in the world. It's very easy to get that multiplying factor to move out.
Latitude, encore presentation this weekend, only on Bloomberg.
We are only scratching the surface in the number of patients we're treating, and it takes quite some time to scale manufacturing to get to many more millions of patients.
This is the man in charge of Europe's most valuable company, Novo Nordisk, and its blockbuster diabetes and obesity drugs, Ozempic and Wegovy. Both contain the key ingredient, semaglutide, revolutionizing the weight loss market and generating billions in sales. Celebrities have helped their popularity soar. Sharon Osbourne, Chelsea Handler, and Elon Musk have all publicly talked about taking Ozempic or Wegovy, and they've had further backing from Oprah Winfrey. It's a global phenomenon, reaching millions on social media apps, including TikTok. But it's not without controversy, including possible side effects, high prices, and the company's lobbying efforts receiving criticism around the world. And in some cases, patients might also need to take the drugs indefinitely to avoid regaining the weight. Chief Executive Lars Frøgaard Jorgensen says obesity is a disease and thinks a company will learn from its growing number of patients.
When I ask the scientists, they say biology and mechanism will tell you that it's chronic treatment. My personal view is that we will also here learn that patients are much different and there'll be different avenues. So we'll have to build a portfolio of interventions.
On this episode of Leaders with Lacroix, I traveled to the firm's headquarters in Copenhagen, Denmark. I asked Lars Frøgaard Jorgensen about the global sensation, how he's navigating the company's meteoric rise, and the sweeping changes they could bring across a range of industries. Lars, thank you so much for being on Bloomberg with us.
Francine, thanks for having me.
I mean, after decades of research, basically Novo finds a molecule that changes everything in terms of weight loss drugs. Were you taken by surprise at the appetite, actually, for these drugs and how mainstream they are?
Yeah, I would actually say there are many surprises when you get products like that. It starts with surprises in the innovation because there are many shots being made on goal and most fail. And the winner is often the one that surprises people the most.
So why do you think this, surprise or success was unexpected? Did it capture something in society that you weren't ready for?
I think we have seen first many decades of our company was focused on type 1 diabetes. Then, because of lifestyle changes, perhaps genetics, there was an increase in type 2 diabetes. But for many years, type 2 diabetes was not intensively treated. Then there was a so-called UK PDS study that really showed that you need to treat type 2 diabetes to prevent comorbidities. And that increased the diabetes market a lot. Now we are kind of seeing the same with obesity, that for years we felt that perhaps obesity is not a real disease, not something you should treat. But that's now being established that actually by understanding the underlying causes of obesity, that there's a lot of play, for instance, genetics, but now also innovations that can actually treat the disease, help people reduce weight and prevent the comorbidities. So I think it's a repeat in a way of what happened with type 2 diabetes. And that then suddenly opens a market that turns out to be way bigger than the diabetes market.
So how difficult is it to have a lifelong treatment? And again, how do you see that changing?
I think we are yet to learn how patient journeys will be much different. Some will be on lifelong treatment. Some will have
say, progressive obesity that will, keep you put more and more weight on, and they'll need more and more efficacious medicine. But there'll perhaps also be some who were actually being on treatment for some time, almost prevents them, and they'll have a different trajectory. I don't think we have seen much of this yet. When I ask the scientists, I'm not a scientist myself, they say, but biology and mechanism will tell you that it's chronic treatment. My personal view is that we will also here learn that patients are much different, and there'll be different avenues. So we'll have to build a portfolio of interventions. Lifestyle will also play into for some of them. And I think we can help many patients get down to a weight that they can maintain and live the life they want to live and avoid many comorbidities for the healthcare systems.
I mean, we also heard from some of the food companies that the chief executives of some of the big groups are having crisis talks. And actually, does this mean that there's going to be a wider adoption of these drugs? Does it mean that people are going to eat and drink 30% less? Do you see it really changing our societies?
I think there'll be many changes, but I think with that also comes opportunities. There'll perhaps be a different preference for snacking. So I think we still need to eat. So maybe perhaps a bit less of the unhealthy snacking and a preference for more of the healthy stuff. So I think for companies, it's also about following the trend and evolving your business and moving to where the market is. And then I think there is probably say an 80-20 perspective here, like in many other sectors, that you will have a few patients who are really heavy consumers. And if those are also those who then start up treatment, I think there'll be a relative bigger impact on some of these companies. But I would say in general, I think it's a bit hyped when we see the reactions we see because we are only scratching the surface in the number of patients we're treating, and it takes quite some time to scale manufacturing to get to many more millions of patients.
Hollywood has also adopted, actually, your weight loss drugs. Is that a good or a bad thing?
We now have a situation where social media, is filled with communication around our products, and that's a complete new for us. We are focused on educating physicians. In most countries, we cannot do direct-to-consumer advertisement. And in all countries, it's really important for us we get physicians to understand which products are approved for type 2 diabetes, which are approved for obesity, what's the mechanism, and how should they be used. And when we see get data from insurance companies, etc., we can see the profile of those who use our medicines. We can see that they are, on average, people with a very high BMI, well above 30. So that is actually also the approved label. So we feel comfortable about that it is people in need of medical intervention to treat serious obesity situations.
But you've become such a phenomenon, and they're memes, and you're right, it's all over social media, and some are saying, look, the problem with this is that it could actually lead to more eating disorders. And this is probably because of the increase in social media. What do pharma companies do? Can they do anything to kind of balance this?
Yeah, I think we have quite spent some time on understanding what does this mean, what's the breadth of it, and we come to realize that we cannot control social media. We try to be present and get our messaging in, but then all our medicines, they take a physician writing a script. So we really focus on the physician to make sure that they understand what are the mechanisms, who are the appropriate patients, what's the label. And then I think we have to also trust that the physicians, they do what is right for their patient. And they should for sure not prescribe for people living with eating disorders.
Coming up, I asked Lars Foregard Jorgensen about criticism the company has faced over its prices, with some analysts predicting the weight loss drug industry could be worth $150 billion a year.
Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's Chief Future Officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. From breakfast cereals to pet foods, General Mills has an iconic array of brands. But future success depends on efficiency, innovation, and insight. CFO Kofi Bruce does much more than crunch numbers.
Our first job is to intimately understand and anticipate the consumer's needs.
Watch Chief Future Officer. New episode Wednesday on Bloomberg Television.